Hospital Hauntings by Sunflower 480. I am a night shift CNA, a certified nursing assistant at a hospital. I have had some strange experiences in some of the rooms, but several in one room in particular. The room that has the most energy is 512. In room 512, I have had a few patients tell me that they see a shadow in the shape of a person in the corner of the room, most often during full moons. Unfortunately, I can't get pictures to show you guys due to HIPAA, patient privacy laws here in America. There have been other odd experiences in that room though. The paper towel dispenser, it will randomly go off even when no one is near it. The clock's minute hand on the wall will move backward and quickly catch back up to the current time, all while making a strange clicking noise. Then, during my shift last night, the room was significantly colder than it typically gets, and the nurse, who doesn't work usually on that floor, felt a sense of dread in that room. I feel it too, but I think I may be a biased source. Am I just being paranoid? Or is something actually happening in that room? I'd love to know the opinions of the swamp. A Haunted Hospital by T. Smitty Scent. So I worked at Warren General Hospital in Warren, Pennsylvania, about 90 minutes east of Erie, Pennsylvania. I worked the night shift and I am a traveling physician, so this was one of the hospitals I traveled to. One night, my floor was slow, so I went to the CCU to help the critical care doctor who was swamped. Well, that night my patient rang her call bell at 3 o'clock in the morning. She asked me, "What does she want?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "The nurse. She keeps coming in here and standing there in the corner." She pointed at the corner behind the door. So I was like, who, Ashley? The nurse I was working with, and pointed to her, sitting at the nurse's station on the computer. She said, no, the other one. Well, there was no other nurse. It was just the two of us. Just FYI, the patient was a woman in her 50s who didn't have a history of mental illness and was not taking any meds that would have made her hallucinate in any way. So I tried my best to kind of just laugh it off, and I was like, "It's just us," and she looked at me, very creeped out, and stared, but she said, "Okay, if she does it again, I'm gonna yell for you," and I told her I'll come right in. Her room was about 8 feet in front of the nurse station, so about a half hour goes by and she yells, "See? There she is!" I got up and started walking. I heard the bathroom shut. It had been cracked open to give her dark little room a little nightlight. I walked in and said, "See, you're dreaming. There is no one else here." She says, "No, she went in the bathroom." So I open the door. The lights are still on and there's no one in there. Looking confused, I say, well, what does she look like? Because I thought someone might be messing around. It's too dark to tell. I can tell it's a woman, but she's so dark and I can't make her face out. So when she says that, I get a little weirded out. But the night ends and I forget all about it. 3 months pass and I pulled back to the same unit. I have the same room as before. This time a man in his early 60s was the patient. Nice guy, seemed alert and oriented, very polite. The night is going good. It's roughly about 3 a.m. and his call light goes off, which means he needs something. So I walk in and he says to me, "You're my nurse, right?" I shake my head and he says, "Well, why does that lady keep coming in and standing in the corner? What is she doing?" I almost crapped myself instantly. This was 3 months later, same room, same thing. I said to him, "Honestly, I think it's a ghost, sir." And he laughed. And I said, "You're not the first one to say that." I started telling everybody about it, and then I found out the entire second floor has a nurse who's been seen every so often. In the 1990s, a nurse who worked up here committed suicide, apparently shot herself in the second floor bathroom. My Experiences as a Security Supervisor by RE98. I work night shift at the hospital my mom also works at. After about a year, I am ready to come out about how I feel in this hospital. I have asked my coworkers if they have ever felt these things either, so I do think some of them have similar stories which I may share in the future. I am 25 years old and I am female. I have been working at this hospital for about a year now. I was promoted in March due to the previous night shift supervisor wanting a better job for himself. Hence, I decided with what I already knew about the hospital, I would step up for my coworkers to be their supervisor. I trust myself and only myself with this hospital. This hospital was horrifying. The amount of things I've heard, what I've seen, and what it's capable of is insane. We have 3 significant buildings, and I'll label them with 3 numbers, 1, 2, and 3. The first building, our first significant one, has a morgue on the ground floor, and we use it because we have to. It's part of our job. Thankfully, that part of our job has changed drastically, so we do not need to be with the mortician during a pickup. Initially, we would have to be in the morgue with the mortician to see if any items were left on the deceased. We do not need to do that anymore. And instead, what we can now do is something that makes us even more uncomfortable. We have to stay in the hallway outside the morgue until everything's ready. We have to let our SOC operator know first. However, after the deceased has been covered and the mortician is ready, we return to the morgue to lock the door. To get to the deceased, they need to have the cold room door in the morgue unlocked, and after they find the dead, we lock the door again. We must ensure it is closed every single time, which is our priority. And that's basically the first building. Our next building is connected to the first building and was built in 2018, so it's relatively new. I will be brief with this because we have issues at our site right now, but this building is also incredibly haunted. We have CCU and ICU on 2 different floors because my mom works here. I know various nursing staff, transporters, CNAs, etc. We patrol this building to ensure no one is lost and our clients feel safe. However, due to CCU and ICU, the hallway lights flicker. One time, a nurse had me investigate an odd sound they were hearing, and when I heard it, it was laughter. It sounded like a child. So I reported it and my co-supervisor told me to leave the area and try not to think about the incident. I investigated to make a general activity log and say to our bosses that everything was fine, but I felt absolutely horrified while I was there. This building is across the street, this next one anyway. I do not go here at all and I refuse to go to the third building. In this building I have had my own experiences of being dragged into rooms, choked, and kicked a couple of times by an unseen force. We have tours and checkpoints that we scan, and whenever we do interior patrols, we feel like someone is watching us non-stop, and it always feels like somebody's following you. I have asked my weekend officers about this building, and they say the same thing as me. They see shadows and get dragged into rooms. Once a badge reader showed green with no one scanning their badge, and the building was locked up. When I was doing a regular shift, I saw a figure in white walking up the stairs, and my ex-boyfriend heard someone walking up the steps, and I definitely saw someone. Then, a couple of weeks later, he saw something that terrified him, and I only listened to the sounds that scared him. My ex-boyfriend was a very competent guard. He was very experienced and nothing seemingly scared him. But that night, whatever we had to follow around that building scared him to his core. We thought it was just a human because it walked into one of the 3 auditoriums we have, and when we followed it, it was absolutely gone, just absolutely disappeared. There was nothing. The next thing we heard could be scratching, nails dragging across the walls. These walls were tall, and that's all we could hear. All through the auditorium, it was like pins and needles being pulled deeply into your ears. We both decided this was enough and we went outside. We eventually went, smoked, calmed down a bit, but I was still very scared and shaking. If anybody has questions, feel free to ask. I still work at this site and I return to work tomorrow at 11 p.m. I need to find out what is going on here. I need to figure it out so I don't go crazy. I've seen a couple of veteran security officers who have worked this site in the past, and they all seem to have some pretty crazy stories as well. Haunted College Hospice by Anonymous. So this happened about a year ago. Some background: I'm a student veterinary nurse. a 21-year-old female. In my placement, I am required to do on-call, so I stay above the vets in a small flat. My first night on call, and I happen to be the only person staying in that flat, and we have 4 or so inpatients, cats and dogs. When someone rings the vets at night, it transfers to our out-of-hours service, which will then transfer any emergencies to our on-vet call. So, it's about midnight and I'm just falling asleep when I hear a loud male shouting outside the window. It sounded like, "I'm going to break in," or something like that. The practice is not a rough area, but it is a little busy, so I immediately sat up knowing something was wrong. I start to hear banging on the front glass doors and I panic. Sometimes when there are emergencies, people won't ring and just drive down and hope someone will be there. I consider going down, but it sounds as if they're trying to break the windows on the doors. Then, I hear nothing for a couple of minutes, and then a smash in the window below my room. The window happens to be the pharmacy. We keep drugs in there, but not dangerous drugs as they are locked away. At this point, I'm pretty terrified. I call the owner of the vets and the police. The owner says she is on her way, and as the 008 service called her to say someone rang and was threatening to break in. So, I have no idea if this guy is in the practice or what. I instantly run downstairs in my PJ to the kennels on the other side of the building as I can hear the dogs barking, and I know most of them are getting worked up with the noise. After I'm sure they are okay, I scout the rest of the practice out apart from the pharmacy room and run back upstairs. I can see out my window onto the street below and just can make out the guy's figure. He is carrying a torch and has his hood up. He runs off, and I'm not sure if he has seen me at the window or anything else. But soon, after the police and the owners arrive, I feel a little bit better. They look around and the window broken is a small window. The hole smashed isn't big enough for anyone to fit through, so the police and owners decide it's fine to leave and go back home. I'm pretty bloody shaken up at this point and am reassured he probably was just some drunk and won't come back. I don't sleep, and about 4 in the morning I hear someone walking on the glass below my window, and the sound of someone cracking the glass off the window. I get up and check out the window and he's back. Now I'm annoyed because I'm so tired after working in the day and can't even sleep thanks to this guy. I stand at the window with my light on, making it obvious that I'm there, and he carries on. So I ring the owner and police again. This time they come and catch him and he pretends he is just out for a walk at night. I shout out the window that he rang the 008 service, and they ring the number he used to ring, and to no one's surprise, it belongs to his phone. I had to do a police statement in my PJs in the staff room by the time we were finished, and it was 6 in the morning. I could have gone to sleep, but I just drove home because there was no way I was staying on my own again. 2 days later, I was put back on call and was in the flat on my own again with the window boarded up. Apparently the guy had been going around the town and following girls home and breaking into cars so they weren't surprised. He wanted to save the animals and stop the noise. The only noise was our drip monitors, and it's not audible from the outside. The dogs only started barking when he tried to break in. Obviously this creep was after some ketamine, and luckily the police took him in and they replaced our window. Just over a year ago, my father had a heart attack. The cardiac part of the hospital goes in one way and out another, so it's pretty hard to find the right door when you're new to visiting that ward. The first time he was admitted, my mother and I found it easy to get there. There is normally a lot of staff around to help. However, the second or third time he had gone onto the ward, they got taken straight in there because of chest pains and they had to go to the emergency department. It was at least a busy time in the hospital, as we were dropping off his medication rather than visiting. Before I really start, I just want to give a clear picture of the hospital. It has 3 entrances, 2 at the front and 1 in the back, with various car parks based around these doors. The hospital is made up of an old and new building which are connected by a bridge. The cardiac ward is in the old part of the hospital. However, this door has limited parking. We go into the back door, rather than the one which goes straight up to the cardiac ward, as the parking around there is full, taking us into a new building. This means that not only do we need to make our way to the top of the hospital, but also to the other side. So we aren't sure where we're going and ask a nurse, who gives us a muddled version of the directions to the cardiac ward. We follow them for a while and end up completely lost. So we ask another nurse who gives us more directions and we're lost again. We're both the stereotypical idiot females when it comes to following directions. So we try following signs, but we aren't sure where we are, and neither of us are familiar with this part of the hospital. Eventually, we end up in an elevator that looks like a service one, as it was sliding the mesh doors rather than solid metal ones. The buttons claim they can get us back to where we were from, so we try it. This puts us at the other end of the corridor that we have been on before, so we take another elevator to put us down on the right floor, which ended up not being the right floor after all. We now have the option of going to floor 0, which my mom informs me is the morgue, as you need a key to get down there, or floor 3, unless you want to go higher. We press to take floor 3 and end up in this empty white hallway with a disused end of a life cancer ward. I'm instantly creeped out. We are in a white hallway with an old ward, beds and equipment are abandoned, an old flight of stairs going up to somewhere you can't see, and is not signposted. A set of double doors at the end of the hall and an older couple in their 50s wearing reasonably modern clothes. There was a man looking into the ward with his hand on the woman's shoulder. She just stood there, facing the wall. My mother looks around and suggests we find someone to ask where we go from here, and does not notice this creepy couple standing right in front of us until I point them out. They do not acknowledge us in the same way she acknowledged them. She then goes and walks down the corridor as I'm contemplating what the hell I should do, because I don't want to stay on my own, but I don't want to go through the doors. Then, this nurse in a uniform that clearly is not the same as the other ones, opens a door just wide enough to get through. She walks into the corridor, looks right at us, and says, "You should not be down here with us." I tell my mom to get back in the elevator, but she tries to ask the nurse where we need to go. The nurse replies, "The highest button." So we get in and press the one she said. Whilst this is taking us to God's who knows where, I have a bad feeling about what just happened, so I try to make sense of it by asking if the nurse's uniform means she works in a specific area or was a higher ranking or something. My mom used to work at the hospital cleaning, so she has seen most of the uniforms worn. She replies no, and that nurse maybe came from another hospital for a training program or to help out. The elevator opens and we get out and walk down another empty corridor. This time we bump into a nurse wearing the usual uniform, walking back towards a different elevator. She stops us from going any further and tells us we are on the floor with operating rooms and we can't stay up here. We tell her that we are lost and get into the elevator with her, which puts us in a completely different part of the hospital where we need to be. Problem solved, apart from that I'm convinced we had an encounter with something paranormal. A few months ago my dad was in the hospital again, and during visiting hours one of his nurses came to talk to us. We had just been talking about what my parents described as a weird experience, and my dad asked the nurse if she knows where we could have been. She thinks that we are playing a joke on her and tells us that this is all the floors that there are, and the floor that we were talked about she has never heard of. She realizes that we are serious though, and she says that maybe we bumped into the hospital ghost, an old nurse who has apparently been seen on the children's ward when a child is dying. After she leaves, the child makes a full recovery. I have heard of this story before, but a kind spirit who helps others, and I can 100% say that whatever we saw was not kind and did not want us around. Of course, I can't be sure that it was really paranormal and not just a lover of the paranormal being biased, but it didn't feel right. They were in old-fashioned clothes. They were see-through. And they were very violent towards us. But I had this feeling of complete dread when we stepped out of the elevator. That coupled with the fact that my mom didn't even see the couple. At least not until I pointed them out. The fact that the nurse said the area does not exist, and the fact that neither of us can remember the facial features of anyone we saw on that floor, just the clothing and the hair color, tell me that what we saw was not normal or good. I now have an absolute fear of going anywhere on my own in the hospital, just in case I see anything else that I'd rather not. I still get the creeps when thinking about it.
Something is plaguing me every night. By Dubiously Yours. I think I finally have an answer for something plaguing me almost every night. Yet, I wish I didn't. I'm lying in bed typing this on my phone because I'm so freaking scared right now. I can't even move. I've lived in this house with my husband and daughter for 2 years. Not long after moving here, I started experiencing these weird, shaking sensations, occasionally at night while lying in bed. It feels exactly like a small earthquake. And honestly, for a long time I just wrote them off as that because I live in Northern California, and there are fault lines everywhere. I could very well have been feeling small tremors. But they're so specific. I'd lay in bed with this disorienting, shaking feeling, and I would jolt my husband awake, and he'd swear he felt nothing. This makes sense. For whatever reason, they're suddenly gone as soon as someone other than me is awake to handle it. Come to think of it, they happen way more often when he's away at work, and it's just me in bed. I've looked up everything. Seismic activity, medical conditions that could cause pseudo-earthquake sensations. Hell, I've even wondered if I'm just hallucinating it. I've even looked into whether anything supernatural could be causing it. Nothing. Absolutely nothing matches what I'm feeling. Nothing explains it. Honestly, it hasn't even been that alarming to me anymore, and it's been more of an annoyance than anything. The one thing I should have thought to do was look under the bed. And that brings us to now. As I lay down in my bed alone one morning, my husband was away on a trip. I'm holding so still I'm barely breathing because the tremors started. I looked over the side of the bed on a whim, and suddenly the tremor stopped. But not before I saw in the dim light coming through the window something I wish I could not see. Something I wish I could just wipe away from my memory. A hand. Abnormally long. Bony fingers and dirty jagged nails released their hold on the mattress and quickly drew back under the bed. As it did, I promptly rolled back away from the edge, grabbed my phone, and hid under the blankets like a freaking idiot. I could hardly believe what I had just seen. It had to be my imagination, right? It couldn't possibly have... There's no way. But I know I saw a hand. Why? Why did I decide to look down there? I could have lived my entire life not knowing this. And what am I supposed to do now? Call the cops? Whatever is down there will get me way faster than anyone can get here. I'm honestly terrified. I don't really know what to do, so I wanted to send this story in. Of course, I have reported this to the authorities, and every time we look under the bed we don't see anything. I'm terrified. There is something wrong here. By Matt. Hey there, Swamp Dweller. My name is Matt, and this is the story of an occurrence I experienced while out in the woods a few months back. A little about me before we get started, so I can preface some things. I'm a state policeman for Florida. I'm a specific type of officer who hunts and catches poachers out in the woods. So I've done and seen a lot of unsettling things, and on top of that, I've got a good bit of tactical and woods training, such as tracking, stealth, and similar areas. I'm not bragging, I'm just making it known so the story is more credible. I've grown up hunting and camping in the woods of Florida, so I'm pretty familiar with how things go around here. Now on to the story. I'd like to keep in shape, so I like to wear armor plates and stuff and go running through the woods to keep myself nice and healthy. I drive my truck to a state forest by my house. I typically like to run just before sunset and during sunset when there's no one in the woods, so I don't freak anybody out and have to explain why I'm wearing bulletproof vest with all this heavy weight attached to it. This time on this evening was no different though. I finished work, changed into my workout clothing, grabbed my concealed carry weapon, put on my shoes, and drove my truck to the forest parking lot. Sure enough, I was the only one there when I showed up. I stretched, put in my earbuds, and started my run. I always run with my badge around my neck, under my shirt and vest, and my gun in a pouch on my vest that's hidden. Nothing was unusual until I was a bit down the road. This was on the latter half of my run. That's when I began to feel uneasy and stopped and took off my headphones. I turned to my right and there was a girl leaning on a tree, seemingly watching me. She looked about my age or just a bit younger. I'm currently 27. I looked at her and said, "Hey." She responded with a smile and a very quiet hello. She was beautiful, had long black hair, multiple tattoos all over her arms, stomach, and some on her neck, and wore a black shirt that showed her belly.
She was wearing tight jeans. If you knew anything about the woods in Florida during the summertime, you'd know it's hot and we get a relentless amount of mosquitoes. That means she was not dressed for the occasion. Immediately, my internal alarm started going off, but I tried to relax. If I hadn't just run 2 miles in the woods, I probably would have had a little bit more adrenaline going on, but I was pretty beat. She mentioned that her name was Lily and started talking to me about what I was doing, why I was wearing what I was, and so forth. Then she began to get a bit more personal, and before I knew it, I followed her deeper and deeper into the woods as it kept getting darker. I was following her further away from the parking lot. I was captivated and terrified, but I couldn't help myself. All my training, instincts, and thoughts were telling me to run. I left there quickly, but I couldn't stop myself. Eventually, as the sun had just gone down, it was getting very dark. My instincts caused me to come to my senses. I stopped and I said I had to get back to my truck, and it was getting late and dark. She did not like this. She immediately started trying to convince me to keep going with her, and when I refused, she approached me, tapped my vest, and said, "This wouldn't have helped you tonight." That freaked me out, and due to my line of work, that is not very easy. The craziest part about all of this is when she said that I could have sworn her eyes were glowing a dim red. I immediately thanked her for the conversation and started to move quickly back to the parking lot, but when I turned around to look as I started running, she was gone. And when I got back to the parking lot, sure enough, my truck was still the only vehicle there. I don't know if she was a demon, a witch, or even a figment of my imagination, but something was very wrong. I've heard of crazy things out in the woods, about the supernatural, but never experienced anything of the such, and I hope to never have to do that again. Thank you for listening, Swamp Dweller. I love the show, and keep up the great work. An Experience I Can't Forget by Pepper. This happened when my son was 4 years old. My son had never had any interest in aliens before this. He had laughed at the idea whenever I watched TV programs on aliens. One day I'm watching a documentary on them, and my son comes out and looks at the screen. He starts to laugh. Okay, typical behavior for him. Then he suddenly says, "Mommy, they're wrong. The grays are tall and a bit blue. Some of the tiny ones are green, though." I asked him where he learned that, as he had never been interested in them. He told me that the man who comes to his window at night told him. This kind of freaked me out, and this definitely freaked his mother out. A strange man coming to my son's window was something to worry about. My son had a loft bed where he slept, and he was at eye level with the only window in his room. I went outside and started looking for any sign that anyone had been there. That's when I realized just how high my son's window really was off the ground. It was easily around 7 foot, so this person would have had to have been 7 feet tall or bigger to look in that window. I don't see any sign of a ladder or anything else being used. I asked my son for more details, and he said this person was named Philip and that he was an alien. He said Philip wasn't his real name and he couldn't pronounce it, so he called him Philip. My son explained that Philip was here studying the flora and fauna of the earth. His word choice caught me off guard. I mean, these are complicated words for a 4-year-old. He'd never used them before to my knowledge. He told me after he saw, I wouldn't accuse him of lying. He explained that Philip was a royal family member of whose brother had recently passed. That meant Philip was next in line for the throne. He had never planned for this, and it meant that he had to give up his passion for science. Philip's family decided that he was allowed to finish his research in plants and animals before he was required to take the throne. This was a rather complicated story for a small child of his age to make up. He added very little to the story, but said that Philip came to him all summer and told him amazing things about space. He even claims his friend showed him how to solve a Rubik's Cube. My son explained that Philip never really spoke, but he would hear his voice in his head. I figured there was no harm in his tales, even if he was making them up entirely. They were harmless, but I did check every morning to ensure that an actual human person wasn't creeping into my son's room. I never did see any sign of it. One night at the end of summer, I was woken up by these loud beeping sounds.
I woke up my husband thinking there was something wrong with the central air. He gets up and walks into the living room, and he suddenly starts calling me and freaking out. I jumped out of bed, raced down the hallway, and realized what's got him so freaked out. He's standing at the front door, looking into the field across our house. I looked out after him, and all I could see were lights. It's brighter than daylight outside. Suddenly, the lights are all just gone in a flash of a second. My husband claims he saw the actual ship. I missed that part entirely. After that, my son didn't mention Philip ever again. He's now 17. I mentioned it to him in passing the other day, and at first he didn't really seem to remember. I didn't give him Philip's name, just the details. And suddenly he goes, "Oh yeah, Philip." He looked suddenly uncomfortable and refused to talk about it ever again with me. The Dardine Family Murders by Swamp Dweller. The last thing you would ever expect to happen in a small or rural town in the middle of nowhere is a gruesome quadruple homicide. By all accounts, Ina, Illinois is a quiet, sleepy town that did not have much more than a general store, a bank, a gas station, a post office, or a firehouse. This case caught my eye. I would assume it was because I came from a small town with roughly only 900 people in it. These small town cases hit home for me. This case is from the 80s, 1987 to be exact. It has many strange and brutal details and is not for the easily squeamish. This is the unsolved story of the Dardine family murders. Before we get into the inevitable, sad, and tragic story of the Dardine family, let's take a few moments to get acquainted with them. The Dardine family consisted of Russell Keith Dardine, his wife Ruby Elaine Dardine, who was pregnant then, and their 2-year-old son Peter Dardine. Russell and Ruby went by their middle names, so I will refer to them as Keith and Elaine throughout the video. By all accounts, it seemed that the Dardine family was well liked, and no one who knew the family had anything wrong to say. The family lived in a trailer home in the woods close to Keith's job at the water treatment facility. Elaine worked at a local office supply store in Mount Vernon. The Dardines were very active in their local church. Keith and Elaine were part of the musical ensemble in the church. Keith sang lead vocals and Elaine played the piano. They were already pinching pennies to save money for Peter's college fund, and as I mentioned earlier, were expecting another baby very soon. In 1987, the Dardine family was expecting their second child and wanted to move to a better area to raise their family. Not to mention, they needed an extra bedroom for the baby. To put the cherry on top, there had been around 15 homicides in Jefferson County alone in the previous 2 years they had been living there. Let's put that into perspective quickly. Only about 38,000 people live in Jefferson County, Illinois. So obviously they decided to put their mobile home up for sale. They had hoped to find a home with a bit more space up in Mount Carmel. This had been the area Keith had grown up in. Due to the violent happenings around them, Keith had become increasingly more protective and paranoid about their safety. He was so on edge that when a young woman knocked on their door asking to make a phone call one night, he would not let her in and told her to go away. Some may say this is paranoia, but I would say that you can never be too safe. The family would never get the chance to move to a safer area, though. It was November 18th, 1987, and Keith had not shown up for work. This is very out of character for a reliable, dedicated employee like Keith. Keith's boss was instantly concerned and made a call to his home but got no answer. Keith's supervisor would call Keith's parents, who both claimed to have not seen or heard anything from him. By nightfall, the police had been dispatched to the Dardine home to check on them. Keith's father, Don Dardine, met with the police to give him the keys to the mobile home. Inside, police found a scene so horrific and so sick that it would forever change everyone involved. First, police found Elaine and Peter Dardine dead. They had been beaten to death brutally and killed with a baseball bat Keith had bought for Peter earlier that year. Elaine had been beaten so severely that she had given birth, and yes, the killer was so gruesome he had even beaten the newborn. Whoever had done this
had tied up Elaine with duct tape and gagged her. The killer had cleaned up the area, showing they had no worries about being in a rush to leave the scene. The only person not found was Keith Dardine. Now, the police initially thought he had murdered his own family and was now on the run. But these suspicions were short-lived as Keith's body was found in a field not far from the family's home. He had been shot 3 times, and even more gruesomely, his manhood had been severed. Keith's car was found parked outside the local police station in a nearby town called Benton, which shows how bold this killer really was. For those interested, Keith drove a red 1981 Plymouth. From the images I could find, it's a hatchback-style car. The car was parked just 10 miles from the Dardine family home. The blood found in the vehicle, which is assumed to be Keith's, shows it may have been the site of his murder and mutilation. The case starts to get even stranger. Elaine and Peter were estimated to have been dead for roughly 12 hours before they were found. Keith had likely been dead for closer to 24 to 36 hours before he was discovered. This detail has made police question whether this was the work of one killer or multiple. Officials were having a tough time putting together a motive. There was no sign of forced entry as the back door had been left open. Robbery did not seem to be the motive either, as cash and valuables were easily accessible but left untouched. No SA was determined to have been done to Elaine, which rules out that aspect. This crime seems way too brutal and violent for it to not be something personal. I am not the only one with this mindset. The Franklin County coroner who did the autopsy on the bodies does not believe this was a random act of violence. He said, "I believe it was a very personal, deliberate thing. Police have speculated this could potentially be a crime of mistaken identity. Of course, many theories exist on what happened to the Dardine family." Keith's mother said she believes someone tried to force Keith into selling drugs, and when he refused, he got mutilated. I find this a bit hard to believe simply due to the sheer amount of violence involved in the crime. If he were simply shot, then that theory would make more sense to me. That's not to say it didn't happen that way, though. Keith's mother also had an idea that someone may have had the hots for Elaine, and when she did not accept their advances, they took their rage out on the family. This could be plausible, but wouldn't you think SA would occur? Maybe not, but it does make sense and could be a possible answer. The next theory will make many roll their eyes and potentially even click away, but this theory has some semblance of logic. Rumors ran wild among locals that the unborn baby Elaine had been ripped from her womb. This, combined with the mutilation of Keith's man parts, sent the locals in a frenzy, thinking satanic ritual killings were being carried out in their neighborhoods. The 80s were the absolute height of the satanic panic hysteria, which didn't help officials move this case forward. As unfortunate as it may be to admit, these rumors, even though likely untrue, did impact the investigation in some sort of way. Whether it was directly or indirectly, it did cause the investigation to be muddied, in a sense. The last theory I wanted to touch on is the serial killer theory. I am unsure where this was suggested or who, but there was a string of suspected serial killings in the area. A regional serial killer was a solid idea then, and still could make the pieces to this puzzle make a bit more sense. Despite a long-standing investigation from Illinois State Police and Jefferson County Police, roughly 30 detectives working full-time, including FBI involvement, nothing outside of a few suggestions and potential profiles came of this. The FBI stated this crime defied their analytic methods and finding a motive was nearly impossible. It is safe to say that in a town as small as Ina, Illinois, the locals were all on edge and paranoid after all of these murders. A local Ina resident told the local coroner, who also doubled as a local doctor, that he lost 14 pounds due to the stress of living next door to the Dardine family home. The Dardine family's landlord even stayed up at night reading books to stay awake out of fear. Nobody knew why the deaths were happening, which made everyone uneasy and made them all feel like a target. This case would sadly, like many others, become a cold case. Now, this doesn't mean it was forgotten, though. Joanne Dardine has worked tirelessly to keep a light on this case. Throughout the 1990s, Joanne would call the single detective still working on the case. She would give them potential leads and ask if they had any new information. She also acquired more than 3,000 signatures from the area to get the Oprah show to share their family's case on the show, but it was declined due to the violent nature of the crime. She did eventually get the case shared on America's Most Wanted after they initially decided not to air the case. For some reason, they did decide to air it in 1998. Sadly, nothing would really come from this, though. No new leads or tips. The story doesn't quite end there, though. In 2000, serial killer Tommy Lynn Sells, arrested for cutting 2 girls' throats in Texas, started to confess to many other unsolved murders across the country. Sells claimed he was a carny who train-hopped across the country. He claimed to have killed the Dardine family after Keith had invited him over for dinner, after meeting him at the pool hall or a truck stop. He claims Keith tried to get him to partake in a threesome with his wife. This story is highly doubted by many, though. The Dardine family were extremely religious, as we mentioned before. Keith was very cautious. Remember how Keith declined a young girl to come into their home and use their phone? Why would he let a 22-year-old man in? This was a common question from locals at the time. Even though Tommy Lynn Sells would confess to upwards of 70 killings, he was only convicted of 22. Officials were convinced he committed those 22, but sadly the Dardine family was not included in that list. It would be doubtful Tommy Lynn Sells killed the Dardine family, but not impossible, I guess. As of now, the complex and disturbing case of the Dardine family murders remains unsolved. This case is one of the heaviest and downright violent I have ever investigated. Every day you find an issue so disturbing and violent, but has no motive and no real viable suspect. If you have any information or tips on what could have happened all those years ago to the Dardine family, please contact the Jefferson County Police. I would also love to know in the comments down below your theories on this case as well. Join the conversation. I get a few different vibes from this case. I almost feel like this was an act of jealousy, maybe. I don't know. It's hard to judge this crime based on the little context we are given. The Valentines Jane Doe by Swamp Dweller. Valentine's Day is one of those minor, yet busier holidays that many lovers across the globe partake in every single year. I know that I love showering my loved ones with gifts on this day to show them how much I care. It seems not everyone is as festive as us. Some people have more nefarious and sinister intentions. This story is a tragic and unsolved cold case from the late 1980s in the rural South. This is the Jenkins County Jane Doe story. To begin with, we need to go back to 1988 in the small town of Millen, Georgia. A man and his girlfriend were scouring the area for cans and bottles for money. Not my ideal way to spend Valentine's Day, but you do what you gotta do. While the man's girlfriend waited in the car, he jumped into a dumpster to find some more cans. Before we go any further, I must mention in the days before this event, a foul odor had been reported around the area. No one had seemingly thought much about it at the time, though. While searching around, he found the source of this wretched smell. This man discovered a duffel bag. He opened the bag with his pocket knife and instantly regretted it. He had made a genuinely gruesome discovery. There were body parts wrapped in plastic stuffed into this duffel bag. The body parts were severely decomposed at this point. At first, the man was in shock and didn't know what to do with this find. For some reason, his first reaction was to get a friend to look at the contents to confirm that this was indeed a bag of body parts. This was precisely what it was, though. A dismembered, decomposed woman's body. But who was this poor woman? This is the true ongoing mystery. Around 4:45 that same day, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, aka the GBI, and the local police were on the scene. Due to Millen being such a small town, the local coroner didn't have the experience needed for this crime scene. Since the local facilities were not equipped for this, the autopsy was conducted in Atlanta by a GBI coroner. It was reported that the woman had been in the dumpster since Friday the 12th, 2 days before she was discovered on Valentine's Day. But reports show she had been dead for at least 4 to 7 days before that. There were no apparent signs of injury, but her feet had been bound. Many other tests were run on Jane Doe. She returned negative for any drugs or seminal evidence, which would have been left behind if an assault occurred. Unfortunately, no cause of death could be 100% determined, which makes profiling the killer that much harder. Rumors do speculate it could have been due to some sort of asphyxiation. No matter how she died, she is considered a murder victim. Since Jane Doe's remains were in such bad shape, the post-mortem photos were not released. At least I could not find them, that is. There are 2 publicly available reconstruction photos of Jane Doe, though. This first sketch was made up by GBI forensic artist Marla Lawson in 1988. It was admitted not to be as detailed as the composite, which was made later. The composite shows what most likely Jane Doe would have looked like. She was estimated to be somewhere between the ages of 16 to 25. She was roughly 5'4" to 5'5" in height, and probably weighed around 135 to 145 pounds. She was described as having a slim build. She has long, thick brown or black hair. There is a rather large dispute in her eye color. Multiple sources report it listed as brown, and others have it listed as unknown. Her dental records show she had good teeth, her upper teeth were somewhat crooked, and she had recently had a lower wisdom tooth removed not too long before she was killed. The last detail I could find is that Jane Doe's legs were freshly shaven. Another detail that has been up for speculation and confusion is Jane Doe's race and ethnicity has not been identified. This may seem trivial, but knowing a victim's race and ethnicity can reveal much information about the culprit. Media rumors speculate that she was Asian with the possibility of being mixed. Though locals disputed that fact and assumed that she was in fact Latina or Native American. Marla Lawson, the GBI forensic artist who created the reconstruction of Jane Doe based on the post-mortem pictures, thought she was of Asian or white descent. The stalemate in conflicting details could be a real monkey wrench in the progression of this investigation. Inside the duffel bag, officials found a pillow, bedspread, bed sheets, and a towel alongside the body parts. The pillow and quilt seemed to be from the same matching set. They both have the same rose design. The bed sheet reportedly had no unique markings on them. The towel had printed butterfly designs on it. The bedding was eventually linked to a Korean manufacturer. Officials aren't sure, but they think these items could have been Jane Doe's property. Now, I did find more details on this case while I was digging around online. I studied deeper into Millen, Georgia, and the surrounding areas, specifically in 1988 when this crime occurred. For some context, Millen is a tiny town. Even today, the city barely hosts 3,100 residents. In the 80s, the town only boasted a few hundred more residents, sitting along 3,800 in its prime. The town of Millen at the time had most of its population made up of African American families. Asian American families were a tiny minority in Millen at the time. After looking at a historical table of the town's population, you can see the Asian American population was only about 0.17% of the population. If we look at the Native American population, it was even less at only 0.06% of the people that lived in Millen. So if Jane Doe came from any of those racial backgrounds, a quick look into the residents at the time could find out very quickly who fit those backgrounds, and could very well help determine who this girl is.
Speculation that does argue against this point, though, is that due to the demographics of the area and the fact that the undocumented migrant workers who came through there seasonally, is suspected that Jane Doe may not even been from the local area at all. It is common for serial offenders to abduct their victims and drop their bodies off in unrelated locations to confuse investigators. Let's be a bit more specific. The dumpster Jane Doe was found in was located off Kaiser Road and Old Perkins Road. Though the actual dumpster was taken as evidence, the area has been cleared now to enlarge the road. There are endless speculations on who, where, and why Jane Doe was killed. Some think she could have been a part of the ever-growing human trafficking epidemic. This was particularly bad at the time, especially for Asian immigrant women, who were often vulnerable and easily manipulated at the time. While reading write-ups on this case, I stumbled upon a Reddit post that mentioned that in Georgia at the time, during this time that this was all happening, these women came from various nationalities. Many were Asian, and exceptionally high number of them originally came from China. It has been suggested that Jane Doe was a victim of human trafficking and could have worked in the many illegal massage parlors and spas, which were merely a front for brothels and human trafficking. Some more exciting details noted at the time is that the man who initially found Jane Doe mentioned he saw a small brown car parked nearby. When he returned with his friend, he noted that the car was gone. I was also able to find some rumblings of an additional report that this alleged small brown car was also seen by some children who were playing nearby. During the interview, the local police were told some interesting information from these two children. They said that they had been playing near the dumpster when they heard somebody crying. They said it was mumbled, but it still sounded like, "My baby! My baby!" At around the same time, they claim a car matching the description of the small brown vehicle pulled up to the dumpster. They described a man and a woman who both looked to be in their 50s. They got out of the car and proceeded to throw something away. On top of these developments, when police further searched the dumpster, they found a half-full gas can. It's not apparent if they think this is related, but I figured I'd throw it in there anyways as well. We don't have too much to go off of. It is speculated online that the killer probably planned to burn the body. When Jane Doe was discovered, many leads came in from the public, but all of them turned into dead ends almost as quickly as they had come in. Now, before I wrap this case up and open the discussion in the comments with you guys, there are a few leads in this case. Now, I know earlier the only known witnesses to this event said they saw an older couple dropping something off in a car as the one reported, but the most significant lead involved a 23-year-old man named Johnny Young. Johnny was a Millen native, but lived in New Jersey at the time. Johnny was investigated after his friend called the police, alluding that they should talk to Johnny about that murder. Even more interesting, Johnny's uncle claimed to have seen him with a Puerto Rican woman who may have even matched Jane Doe's description. Here's where things get even more questionable. Johnny's uncle claims his nephew was involved with two drug smugglers. One of these smugglers was dating this unidentified female. Johnny had run away with both the smugglers' money and the girl. Johnny did admit to knowing one of the smugglers but not the other one, and he also stated that he did not know a Puerto Rican girl. The GBI could not find substantial evidence that Young had either been seen with such a woman or that she even existed. It would later come out that Johnny and his uncle had a strained relationship. This may have influenced the uncle to say some out-of-hand statements. This sounds like it would end here, but it doesn't. In the summer of 1991, Deputy Campbell of the Jenkins County Sheriff's Office received a phone call from an anonymous caller in New Jersey. This caller claimed that they know who killed the Jenkins County Jane Doe. The caller referred to Deputy Campbell by his first name and asked, "Do you remember that girl?" and said that he was tired of running. This caller claimed he had tried to turn himself into the New Jersey police, but they had not believed him. The caller told Deputy Campbell to come pick him up and hung up the phone. Deputy Campbell has never been able to contact the caller again, but the family believes it was Johnny Young who called him that day. They eventually tracked Johnny down and questioned him about the phone call. He denied that he had ever made the call and relayed the same story as the first interview, but
He did add in some new details, like how his uncle and another man had shown him the dumpster at some point before Jane Doe had been found. The GBI re-interviewed Johnny's family and friends, but this also ended up just as a dead end. Since this initial lead, though, no new information has been developed in this case. The only suspect we had died in 2006. Crow Fields Funeral Home in Millen cremated Jane Doe's body. It is unclear why they did this, as murder victims are usually not burned, but seeing as Millen is a small town, it is not unfathomable that something like this would happen, even though the GBI did attempt to retrieve unusable DNA from the bedding found with her remains. On the brighter side, her dental records and fingerprint could be used to help identify her one day. Many searches to find a match have been unsuccessful thus far. And that is where the story of the Jenkins County Jane Doe ends, at least for now. I believe something evil has let itself into my home. By Katie. I believe something evil has let itself into my home. This story continues as new events happen every day. I live with my boyfriend up in the Appalachian Mountains. I've been in between jobs since moving in, so I'm just alone with our cat, Mimi, during the day and for the most part of the evening. Last week, I was doing some chores around the house, cleaning it up after a recent party we had. After deep cleaning everything, I took a shower to get all the grime off of myself. While I was in the shower, I could have swore I heard stomping and banging. I paused to listen closer, but I thought it could have just been the cat running around. After leaving the shower, I forgot about the noises I had just heard. I went downstairs in my towel to suddenly feel the cold living room. I looked on the couch to see Mimi lying on a blanket, and just behind her I could hear the blasting sounds of crickets, which I thought was kind of bizarre. I walked around the corner to see our front door was wide open. I knew I had locked that door this morning after my boyfriend left for work. Oddly enough, the door still had the lock position on, but there it was, wide open. I was paranoid for the next couple of hours, thinking of what could have opened the door. I did multiple sweeps around the house to see if there was an intruder inside, but there was no trace of anyone but myself. By the next day, I shrugged it off, thinking maybe the door jamb was somehow open. I don't know. Once again, I was alone, eating my breakfast on the couch, when I heard a loud thump and noise. At this point, it sounded like something was dragging. It sounded like it was right above me, upstairs. I paused the TV and listened. I heard nothing. My heart started thumping faster, but I continued having breakfast and tried to brush it off. I continually heard thumping, stomping, shuffling, and dragging noises upstairs for the next few days. As a spiritual person, I am open to the possibility of ghosts and spirits. Yesterday was the most bizarre day by far, showing me that if it was a spirit, they are becoming more assertive in more ways than one. Yesterday was the same day-by-day chores and task, but the presence of some spirit was more evident than before. I heard thumping upstairs again and saw a white, translucent, foggy apparition drifting through the hallway. I was frozen and shook my head in fear, trying to wrap my head around this reality. The figure looked to be half of a person, with a long dress or coat on. I only saw them for just a split second, and I tried to take in as much detail as I could. I was so paranoid that I left the house to go into town for a while, thinking a change in scenery would help. When I returned home, I noticed half of my Halloween and autumn home decorations were lit up. I was perplexed, since the ones being turned on were operated by an on and off switch, and I knew I had turned them off the night before. Later in the evening, I heard footsteps at the top of the stairs, as I was in the kitchen, which had a clear view of the first few steps. I saw no shoes or any physical image, but the noises continued. I tried to make dinner in peace, but I heard the strangest noise again. It was the distinct sound of water turning on and running upstairs, and after about 5 seconds it abruptly turned off and shut off the faucet entirely.
I was on the defense and ran upstairs to check the bathroom above the kitchen. The tub and sink were absolutely bone dry, and the toilet didn't flush since there wasn't any water refilling and running. I stood there in silence, trying to figure this whole thing out. This morning I thought about these encounters, and what could be an explanation. I looked more into spiritual beliefs and thought about how everything started after the door was open. I am aware of the folklore around the Appalachian Mountains, which leads me to believe that something welcomed itself into my home. I firmly believe that an entity or spirit let itself inside since I wrongly put up a welcome sign, and since then it's making itself known in our home. Every day it's getting more apparent that something unseen is inside. Knowing I let something into my home on accident, and with it getting stronger, I know I must make it leave and never return. So I'm gonna have somebody come bless the house, and I'm hoping that's gonna be enough. I'll update you in the future. Thank you for sharing my story. The Man Under the Stairs by Lozzie G. We have just moved into a new house. It backs onto a country park, so our garden is not overlooked by other neighbors, just tall trees and wildlife. At the other side of the road, however, they have just started to build a brand new estate, and there is heavy machinery turfing up land that has laid dormant for many years. My home does not really look haunted. It's not dark and gloomy, it's actually quite the opposite. It's light, airy, and spacious. Just right for my husband, myself, our 2 children, and our dog. We love it. As I was cleaning my house one Saturday, I noticed a figure in my peripheral vision. I stopped dusting and looked open to the open kitchen door. A tall man in a long coat was standing by my sun lounger, with one foot up on it, looking into the distance as I thought he probably was deep in thought himself. I blinked and looked again, and I swear I didn't even look away, and suddenly he was gone. I shouted for my son, who was upstairs, put my cleaning stuff down, and headed towards the open kitchen door. But by the time I got out there wasn't a single sign that anyone was ever there. I headed out to the side of the house, which has a long passageway leading to a gate. He wasn't there either. He couldn't have gone through a locked high gate or over the back fencing so quickly that I missed him. He just entirely disappeared. My son came running out with his weapon of choice, which was apparently a hand whisk. Yeah, so I guess we would have been in good hands. I laughed at it though. I asked him if he was going to bake our intruder a cake, so he slopped off back to his room. In the next few weeks, I kept seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye that disappeared upon further investigation. Nobody else ever would see these things, and they always rolled their eyes in disbelief when I told them. We have security cameras around the house, and we review them every single day. The last footage that I saw was kind of weird. There was a loud banging and knocking in the passageway leading to the gate, but there was absolutely nobody there. Then you can hear a raspy whisper. We are both undecided on what it's saying. We don't know if it's saying morning or warning. We sent it to the rest of the family, who said it was weird. Myself and my sister went to the medium in the next town over, and without even prompting anything, she said that I had moved into a new house, and a gentleman who had resided on the land previously had found his way back through all the excavation and building processes being done. Of course, the man had died years ago but couldn't find his way to the spirit world. Of course, my hair stood on end, especially as she was said to be sad and lost, and hiding in the cupboard under my stairs. My family thinks I'm totally mad, but I'm going to try to get a paranormal expert to come in and help them move on. I feel so sorry for them. I hope this can be done and they find some peace. I'll update you when I found someone I trust to help me. I Didn't Sleep That Night by L. I live in New Mexico, Las Cruces, New Mexico to be specific. When I was about 14 or 15 years old, my mother and I would stay home alone since my father worked nights. Every night was calm and we never really had any type of issue, until one night we each went to our rooms to get ready for bed. The house was completely dark,
and the only sound that you could hear was the sound of the ceiling fans. It was already around 11:30 p.m., and I was very sleepy, so I decided just to try and sleep when I lay down and cover myself. I heard something strange on the window. It almost sounded like some sort of loud crying, like a baby was being tortured. I was so scared, all I could do was hide under my covers. The crying lasted about 5 minutes, followed by some type of scratching noises on my window. Then I heard what sounded like something coming to my room. I was freaking out because I was really hoping it would be my mother at this point. And sure enough, it was her. She asked if I was hearing these noises and if it was me making them. I of course told her I had heard them and it was not me. It was super loud and suddenly it began tapping on my window even more. We were both confused and we decided not to try to fight where the sound was coming from. But just then, when she was about to go back to her room and turn off all the lights, we heard another loud noise. Again, it sounded like the crying, but this time it almost sounded like it was a demonic chorus or something. That night we did not sleep, and in the morning we explored outside by my window. There were some small prints of something, but it was hard to say from what. I still get chills when we think about this story. There's just something wrong about that house. The Honey Island Rougarou by Boudreaux. Hi Swamp Dweller, my name is Boudreaux, and I was born and raised in the Honey Island Swamp, one of America's most extensive and wild swamps, still mainly uninhabited. The Honey Island Swamp is located roughly about 30 minutes away from the famous New Orleans, which would explain the many encounters with voodoo, witchcraft, and just creepy stuff that lurks out in the cypress swamps. I have many stories of mine and my father that I would like to share for the future, but let's go where it all started. I grew up on a shack built upon a pontoon due to the unexpected changes in the water levels on the West Pearl River, and we lived off the land eating whatever we could catch, hunt, or anything in between. Normally this included things like turtles, crawfish, alligators, snakes, raccoons, and so much more. These were the times before the ever-expanding suburbs and the swamp tour boats were encroaching, so we could live in peace without being judged. But this also meant that the wildlife and other unexplainable things were more likely to take place. By the time I was 10 years old, I would run our small crawfish boat, or pirogue, deep into the swamp to check out our crawfish traps or trot lines, so I could help put food on the table for my parents and our 4 siblings. On this particular event, I took the small, motorized crawfish boat north towards the Bouge Chateau to check out a few trot and jug lines and maybe shoot a few animals from the ship for food. My motor was killed when I finished making my rounds through the sloughs and inlets. As luck would have it, I had no form of paddle on board, and the strong current of the Pearl River was pulling me downstream. Still, luckily, I pulled ashore before I hit any bad jetties. As I made my way ashore, I tried to figure out what was wrong with the motor. It was from the early 50s, so it could just be that it was old. After an hour of rest with no luck with the engine, the sun began to set and I wasn't too worried, for I've spent many nights in the swamp alone, which may not be ideal or even scary to others, but that's not a big deal. I was sure my father would come up the river to look for me once sun was up. I found a little bit of high ground a few feet off the river and climbed up a tree because one place you do not want to sleep is on the floor in a swamp. If a gator or a snake doesn't find you, the fire ants will. And I had been asleep in the old oak tree for a few hours until an unearthly howl awoke me. It didn't sound like the typical owl or coyote. We don't have wolves in South Louisiana unless they're in a zoo. The howl startled me because of how stressed and deep it sounded. It also sounded very close. My young mind began to race thinking about the stories of the Rougarou my mother would tell me to behave. This large wolf man would eat the bad children up if they didn't act well, which to me now is a child version of what it is. The Rougarou is the result of some evil witchcraft or voodoo or evil spirit that haunts the swamps and bayous of South Louisiana in the form of a wolf man. 10 minutes after the terrifying howl,
I began to hear the shuffle of the briar bushes near the base of the tree, and I prayed that it was a small rodent of some sort, but it was the complete opposite. The midnight moon lit the creature up as it stepped out into the clearing not only 15 feet in front of me. It was about 6 feet tall, with long hair and yellow eyes. This thing, whatever it was, stood on 2 legs, and the stench it let off was similar to that of a wet dog mixed with a skunk. I do not know if the creature saw me, but I felt it could smell or maybe hear me. I was frozen in fear, daring not to make a noise after what seemed like a lifetime of the creature stalking around the base of the tree. I could see a faint light and hear the roar of a boat coming up the river. The creature seemed scared of the raft and was gone by the time I looked back down. I jumped 15 feet from the oak tree, spraining my ankle in the process, and ran back to the boat as fast as possible to wave down the oncoming ship. I safely returned home that night and was terrified to enter the swamp alone, with or without proper equipment. I learned that the swamp holds much more than we know, for it is the unexplored areas that these creatures live. Today, 30 years later, many locals still call that animal that many have claimed to see the Rougarou, or the Honey Island Swamp Monster. Still, I can tell you, it's just one of the many unexplainable things I have witnessed inside the swamp. Thank you for listening to my story. If you enjoy it, there will undoubtedly be more about the Honey Island Swamp. My Michigan Dogman Encounter by Ellie D. Hello, Swamp Dweller. I have listened to your videos for about 4 years now, so I decided to share my Dogman story. I will give some background detail on this story to start. I am a 13-year-old female. I live in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, around the Morsing-Marquette area, and a side note, I live on Native American land, far back in the woods. This story took place in about mid-August this year. I had invited one of my friends over. At the time, she lived on a road we call Old Indian Town Road. I'm not a native, but have always felt some spirituality like natives. I consider myself a psychic, so my friend, who I will call Chloe, was doing teenage everyday things. Eventually, she got bored, and we decided that we would go and see some cool things by ourselves. We got on our bikes and decided to ride them around. I am the most athletic of my friends. I play many sports and work out daily. Eventually, we met up with some other friends and got tired of riding up and down the short road we lived on. It got to the point where only 3 of us remained. In the beginning, there were around 8 or 9 of us in total. At this point, it was around 9:30 p.m. I have always been terrified of the dark, so at this given point, I started to get uneasy naturally. I wouldn't say I liked being surrounded by thick woods on either side at 10 o'clock at night either. So we started making our way back up the road. The road is on a relatively steep hill, steep enough to where most people can't bike up without the struggle, even myself. I bike frequently, but I was tired from biking all day, so I strolled up the hill with my youngest person in the group right beside me. She started to get uneasy as well. The other friend was far behind us. He isn't a believer in anything supernatural. He was at the bottom of the hill, and we were near the halfway point. Suddenly, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I thought I was being paranoid at first, until I had the sudden strange feeling to look to my right. I suddenly snapped my head in that direction. My friend from behind me was looking down, talking to me about something, so she didn't notice me stop. We were on the far left of the road, and on the right there was a drop that ran down very far, deep into the woods. Very tall pine trees were filling that deep trench. The woods were so thick you couldn't see the ground and the makeshift track. When I looked over though, I saw a tall, skinny figure looking at me while clinging to one of those incredibly tall pine trees. It almost looked like an emaciated werewolf, but worse than its appearance was what it was doing. It swayed back and forth in the tree, almost like a big cat, with large, orange eyes blinking at me occasionally. That's when my friend noticed I had stopped. She asked me what was wrong, and I didn't say anything. I didn't want to freak out anyone. I just started walking even faster. My guy friend was still at the bottom of the hill. My other friend and I were almost at the top. I had the worst feeling continuously washing over me. My guy friend finally noticed how far ahead we were and booked it to catch up with us. When we returned to my house, I told them what we saw. The girl behind me agreed that
She didn't see what I saw, but definitely felt uneasy when she saw me looking to the right and then speeding up. Nothing more happened that night, but the next day I was walking over to my next door neighbor's house. I was walking over to the girl who was with me when it all happened. That day, she and I rode our bikes and talked about it the night before. It was a lovely day, so we rode our bikes until the sun set again. At one point, I went back to my house to grab something. Walking on the trail to get to her house, I got hit with a sense of dread. That's when she met me, and she started running with me because she felt it too. When we broke out of the tree line into her backyard, we heard a scream that sent us bolting toward her house, and that concludes my story. The Thing in the Snow by Dr. Knoll. To preface this, I am an avid hunter, and this is not my first time nor my last weird encounter I've seen while hunting. This encounter happened 2 years ago in December, and now on to the story itself. I went out hunting. I was hoping for a giant buck this day. On the drive to the spot where I parked my truck, I saw something, and it was truly odd. It was snowing out, so I could not see all that well, but I could have sworn I saw an outline of a person on a hill looking at me. It was my friend's land. It was private property, so no one should be here, but he let me and a few of our friends hunt here from time to time. So it was odd to see someone none of us knew were supposed to be here, and I was the only one of my friends who were supposed to be hunting today. I definitely made sure of that. I was thinking, sure, maybe somebody got lost, but there is so much signage that says this is private property, you'd have to be dumb to not see it. And it was so early in the morning, I figured it has to be somebody who doesn't have the greatest intentions. Anyway, I wasn't that worried, so I just parked my car and got out to my tree stand. I was there for a couple of hours, and I did not see a thing. I was waiting for something to walk by as the forest started to fall silent. And if you are a hunter, and pretty much anyone, you would know that if that happens, it's never a good sign. But then I saw the perfect deer walk in front of me. It was alone, and it was running, which was not all that uncommon, but it was frail looking. I did not fire at it at first. I just watched it. I looked behind it, and something jumped on it. A white human-looking creature. I clutched my rifle and looked down my sight for a better look, but it must have heard me. It looked up at me and smiled the most blood-chilling smile I have ever seen. I fired at it. It missed and hit the ground. It seemingly jumped back, freaked out, hissing at me. It started twitching and raising its head, and then everything suddenly froze. It froze in the air like something had happened. I could feel the utter malice this thing had for me. I reloaded as fast as possible and fired again. This time, in this thing's chest. It fell again, but this time it did not get back up. I sat there for at least an hour. I dared not move in fear that this thing would get back up. Eventually, I got the energy to run back to my car. I got back in my car and drove away and did not look back. I don't know what that thing was. I've never seen it again, and I've never gone back. That's No Deer by Mickey L. My name is Mickey. I have no other explanation for this story, so I thought I'd share it here. I just turned 16 years old and decided on my birthday to stay and visit my sister, who lives in Cleveland, which is about an hour's drive away from my hometown. I had been there for a few days already, and since my birthday is on the 23rd of June, the 4th of July is right around the corner. I had been upstairs in the attic for a few days sleeping, playing GTA, and doing some other things to keep me occupied because I had nothing else to do since I couldn't drive yet and my sister was at work most of the time. One night, my sister Morgan and her boyfriend Nate were sitting downstairs in the living room watching TV when Nate asked if we wanted to go to this secluded park and light some fireworks off. I immediately said sure because I had nothing better to do and I knew some of the parks were secluded from the big city from Cleveland. So, after about an hour of persuading Morgan to go, we all jump into his car. It's about 75 degrees out and it's about 1:30 a.m. It's a relatively nice night. We were driving for about 15 minutes when we finally reached this park. We are going down this giant hill when it suddenly gets exceptionally dark. There's no light pollution and no other artificial light, just what you can see from the headlights. We're driving for 10 minutes when I see a deer on the side of the road, which is typical for a wooded park, right? I I look out my window and for a brief second, I see what looks like a giant deer face with glowing yellow eyes jerk behind this tiny tree and disappear entirely. I don't usually get freaked out by deer, but something about how fast it moved and how it just disappeared made me feel unsettled. It just looked wrong, and I'm pretty sure deer's eyes shouldn't be glowing that way. We finally arrive at a parking lot facing a giant field and the other side being woods. I still had a very unsettling feeling that I could not shake off. When we got out of the car, I noticed it had gotten cold outside, which doesn't make sense because it was just warmer out a minute ago. I felt a noticeable chill. I was leaning on the car and my sister's boyfriend went to set up his firework. I still felt we needed to leave, but I couldn't shake off this feeling, so I told my sister that we should hurry up and go because I felt weird. My sister, stubborn, just said to me that I have too much superstition and need to chill out. I watched the fireworks go off and we all looked at the stars for a little bit. After getting in the car, we sat for a bit when I heard branches breaking and heavy footsteps. The feeling I had before worsened, so I told my sister and boyfriend we really had to get home. I noticed off in the tree line that there looked to be a deer, but there was something off about this deer. From what I could tell from the silhouette, it was standing on its hind legs, just staring at us, seemingly trying to hide behind a tree. While doing so, we eventually started driving off. Once we all got home, I still felt off about what I saw. I couldn't shake that feeling either. There was no way a deer had a big face like that. There was no way it could stand on its hind legs just staring at people for such a long time. The feeling I got was not expected. Afterward, I went upstairs to my attic room where my sister and I watched TV. I like to leave my windows open because the breeze from the lake feels good at night. I also like listening to the traffic and crickets, and occasionally you can hear the birds early in the morning. It was about 3:30 to 4 when my sister and I were sitting there, and I told her what I saw. She shook it off and told me I had probably just seen a deer. Then I noticed outside that I didn't hear anything. It was just quiet. That isn't normal at all for Cleveland, and not the peaceful quiet, the eerie type of quiet. Then I heard a very loud whistling coming from different parts of the neighborhood. I thought there was no way a human would be whistling that loud. It just emanated from so far but never lost its volume, let alone it was coming from all different directions at the same time. I closed the curtains and asked my sister if she heard it, and she replied with, "What are you talking about? I don't hear anything." Then the unsettling feeling set in again, and my stomach sank. I didn't sleep a wink that night. I still don't know what I saw that day nor what was whistling, but I'm hoping that I never have to see it again or hear it again. The Creature of Mirror Hollow by Eliza C. Thunder roared across the sky. The loud booms echoed overhead like a giant strolling through the area amidst the rain, which tapped on the windows like claws prying their way into the safety of the cabin. I was stranded, alone in the darkness of the wooden shelter. I found myself in a precarious predicament. I didn't get much time before the storm hit. It was so sudden, you may even say it was bizarre. The last thing I remembered before it all started was I had walked off the path to a side trail to forage for some stuff I had seen on TikTok that might be in the area. However, I noticed something was off. The trees, they just weren't right. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but as I walked on, it hit me. None of the trees were different here, all completely symmetrical, almost as if someone copied and pasted one all over this part of the forest. Only then did I notice the sky. Inky black clouds blotted out the sun in an array of unnatural shapes, and the thick foliage overhead made it hard to see, but my visibility dropped to near blindness. I knew I had to find shelter and fast, but I didn't know where I was anymore. My only hope was the trail, which thankfully hadn't gone away yet. I didn't know where it went, but I knew it had to go somewhere, and indeed it had to end sometime soon. So that was my plan. I booked it full throttle down the trail. This was a mistake, as the first crack of thunder shook the sky. With it came the tears of God, an immense downpour and the likes I had never seen before. I had only been running for 10 minutes before my luck ran out, and I slipped into the wet earth beneath me. Falling hard and forward, a blinding white flash illuminated my downfall. I could see the cabin ahead of me, right before I ate a serving of mud pie. The shelter was within my grasp at last. I didn't get up right away though, and I think I regret that the most, because then I heard it. Among all the noises, One stood out as I rested my eyes. It was faint, but it was there. A wet slapping noise was quick, like bare feet in the mud headed this way but not on the trail. As it grew closer, you could hear the trees falling as they tore through the dense forest, each crash distant, rumbling the earth as if it was competing with the sky's voice. My heart fell 10 stories in my chest as the threat was realized. I only came out here for some fungi, not for whatever this thing was. I tried quickly to get up, desperately trying to avoid slipping as I did. I hurried to the cabin as the sky and earth shook together in an elaborate song for the lightning to dance to. That thing drew near as I made it to the door. I prayed for the first time in my life that it wouldn't be locked, and to my amazement it was not. I ran through the doorway, slammed it, and I fell around the edge of the door and locked it in a panic and made sure all the windows were locked as well. As I heard the trees crashing just outside, accompanied by that dreadful wet slapping, I almost thought I was too late. But I had found it. A latch. I couldn't help but chuckle as I realized just how little this would probably do. But I obviously locked everything regardless, as it could buy me just a second of time. After I had an opportunity to get my bearings together, I turned away from the door as another flash illuminated the interior through a nearby window. There was a table upside down in the middle of the room. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust, and chairs were knocked over and astray. There appeared to be no other furniture and only 2 rooms, the second being the bathroom. There was no food, water, or any sign of life. I could only wait out the storm and hope that that thing doesn't find me here. That brings us to where we are now, suffocated in the blackness inside the far corner of the cabin. The tension in the air as thick as I desperately racked my brain for an idea. My thoughts were interrupted by terror as a loud slam made the door shudder, followed by a horrible scream. It was so shrill I had to cover my ears. I thought they might explode. My head was pounding as it ceased its screaming. Not waiting for a second assault on my ears, I quickly checked for a bathroom. Maybe it'd have a small window I could climb out of. Unfortunately, the window in the main room was close to the door, and I knew I couldn't outrun that thing. I couldn't let it see me leave the cabin. I entered the bathroom instantly. Seeing a lack of any window, I wanted to give up and cry, but there had to be something. Anything. I returned to the main room just as quickly as I had left. I screamed, my voice filled with terror and despair as I saw it. A bright flash lit up just enough to catch a glimpse of it as it stood crouched outside the window peering in. Its empty black sockets devoid of life but filled with rage. It was a deer skull, no doubt. It wasn't too tall, and its anatomy was all wrong, almost broken as if it were in agony and its bones were screaming. It radiated death, and I was frozen in its cold stare. In the corner of my eye, I noticed a fireplace as another flash illuminated the room. But the creature had disappeared at this point, and I knew it couldn't be far, only trying to find a way in. So I dove for the fireplace. After being snapped out of my daze, it was my last option. I didn't give it good odds. Part of me already dug a grave for myself in my mind. I didn't get far inside before the sound of wood splintering shattered any hope I had left. The door flew off its hinges against the back wall, the creature audibly slamming into the wall with it probably having jumped full force into it. I made sure to tuck my feet in amongst all the commotion. But my breathing panicked and I had difficulty calming myself down. I was sure it would find me, as I could hear the wood groan under the weight of each step it took, as it searched around. One heavy thud after the other, slow and deliberate. Each one sent an icy chill down my spine. Then the smell hit me. It must have been just in front of the fireplace. It smelt like earth and rot with the metallic blood smell mixed in. It was putrid, like a decaying corpse in a shallow grave. But it was much worse. My throat felt ticklish. The stench was too much and I couldn't hold it any longer. I gagged hard, spitting up below. It snarled and its maw snapped with a primal hunger as it shoved its head inside the base of the fireplace. I screamed in horror as hot tears steamed down my face, desperately trying to go up further in the fireplace. As I thrashed, I managed to make it about 5 feet up the chimney, but it too was trying to cram its massive frame inside. My muscles were sore and I was tired. I felt like giving up as I watched it well. I sobbed and screamed, my arms and legs were shaking under the strain as I pressed hard against the inside of the chimney. Finally, I felt my consciousness begin to fade under the stress as I looked down at the creature, its vicious snarling and biting never ceasing as it seemingly got closer and closer, and that's the last thing I remember before I fainted inside the chimney. I thought that would be the last time I'd ever be alive. However, I woke up, which was a surprise. I didn't think that was possible. If I were dead, which I without a doubt was, but no, I wasn't to my dismay. I had got stuck in the chimney, so I had never fallen when I fainted. It must have given up at some point, but not without much effort. Bricks had been completely torn away, and it still wasn't enough to reach me, and for that, I'm grateful. But there was still a problem. I was still stuck in the chimney, and the cabin was abandoned. No one would be coming here purposely. I didn't even know where it was. Was there even hope for an escape in this strange forest of identical trees? Or was I doomed as soon as I went off the main trail? I really can't tell. I'll only be able to live so long stuck in the chimney without food or water. I've been trying to get unstuck for about an hour now, and my phone is about to die. So I'm finished writing this as not a send-off, but a warning. If you find this phone, I beg you, please share my story. I'm sure you'll have a dreadful time reading it at first, so it's up to us. If you ever find this place in the forest where every tree is identical, turn back now. Don't be lured into its dark corners where the creature roams, waiting for you to enter its domain. Joshua Tree Not Deer by Anonymous. I went to Joshua Tree National Park a few days ago in an Airbnb with 3 of my friends. The house was a nice size and had to be accessed by an unpaved dirt road. The closest place to us was maybe a mile or 2 away. All the homes in this area have private driveways. On one of our drives back from getting groceries, I saw an animal run away from our headlights very fast, but I couldn't quite make it out. I assumed it had to be a deer, or something along those lines because of how big it was, but all I had seen thus far were desert quails. That night I dreamt that my friends and I were searching for something, and we were taken to a basement of all things, and it was full of all sorts of strange oddities. It was a small house with a red door. We went inside, but I don't remember what was there. This may or may not have anything to do with my experience. I read that dreams do often correlate with experiences, though. On one of the nights of our stay, we had a bonfire and did some stargazing. I had to pee at one point, so I went inside and was gone for maybe 5 minutes max. When my friend and I returned, my 2 other friends weren't sitting by the fire anymore. So I just sat and waited for a couple of minutes for them to come back, but I went inside to check on them eventually, but they weren't there either. We go back out and start calling for them and get no response. Instead, we hear coughing coming from the right side of the house, where the pool area was. We immediately knew it was our friend because they had been reserved. Our first instinct was to find and help them. At some points during our trip, we had gotten concerned that they were sick, but they ended up feeling much better. We start looking for them by the pool, but we call again and we get no response. But we do hear the same coughing, the same pitch, everything. It's almost like a mimic. It was the same cough maybe 4 or 5 times in a row. We thought our friend was throwing up or maybe smoking. Usually when we called for them though, they would answer immediately. Except for this time, there was just more coughing. The last time we called, they had finally answered and started coming around from the opposite side of the house from where we were. Unfortunately, the sounds of them walking and talking went from the left side of the house just seconds after we heard them coughing on the right side, and they were utterly oblivious to everything that was happening. They had no idea about the coughing, and didn't even hear us calling until they got closer to the house. As soon as I realized the coughing was a lure for us, it confirmed that something had been keeping an eye on us. Based on what I've read, I'm not sure if this is a skinwalker experience, a not deer experience, or something similar. I'll answer any questions. I also need to know if I should go get cleansed. This can't be chalked up to hearing things because of weed. We all have high tolerances, and weed doesn't make you hear things. Anybody who says that has clearly never really smoked. We were both very aware, and I was probably the soberest. It was hushed, too. We had to turn off the music because we were talking. We ended up smoking later that night, and the friend we thought we heard coughing had such a soft cough that you could barely listen to it. The pitch of the coughing we heard specifically sounded like our friend, but as if it was stuck in their throat or throwing up. My Camping Trip by D. Pernet. This is a true story, as I was present for these events. Had this not happened, I would have had difficulty believing this story myself. To this day, I can only tell this story or go into deep thought about the events of that day if I become somewhat shaken. It was the fall of 1984 in the upstate of New York, in a small town called Scotchtown, a relatively rural part of the state. The cool weather hadn't yet set in, and it was still warm enough that my two friends, Brian and Mike, wanted to go camping. We were all 16 years old, and I had never been camping at that point. I was excited about the trip. That week after school, we went to the Army and Navy store and bought a surplus Army tent, some pots and pans. Brian purchased a lantern, and both had bought old military K-bar knives. We set out for our overnight camping trip that Friday after school. We had each told our parents we were staying at each other's house to avoid any problems the journey may cause with our parents. Friday after school, we all rode the bus to Mike's house, where we had all stashed all our camping gear for the trip. We gathered all the equipment and walked down the road farther into the county's rural parts. We had made this trek many times during the day, explored the wooded areas fairly extensively during the daylight, and we knew where we were headed. We walked about an hour into the countryside before cutting down a dirt road that led to a trail we had been on many times during our daytime explorations. However, we had never been out in these woods at night. We reached the trail opening at around 5 p.m. and ventured into the forest. An old stone wall marks this trail. These walls are ubiquitous in the area and were used as property dividers when the area was first settled sometime in the early 1700s. The trail followed right alongside the wall for many miles, and we could never find where the two separated. As we were walking into the woods, the wall was now on our left. The area we traveled to was a combination of dense patches of trees and vegetation and many more open regions with scattered trees. In these more open areas, we often came across stone foundations of homes that used to stand there, and occasional headstones where early settlers had buried loved ones on their property. We walked for about an hour, and because the canopy of trees was very thick, it was starting to get dark. Still, light out, but dimming, so we thought it was best to stop before dark. We came upon a clearing to our right with a relatively large tree, and we could camp directly under it. To give an accurate idea of what our campsite looked like, standing in our campsite, if you looked forward toward the trail, it would be the trail, then the stone wall. On the other side of the wall, directly opposite our camp, was a giant oak tree about 4 feet in diameter, standing alone, and a few scattered trees behind it, but it was a relatively open area. The oak tree was less than 20 feet from our campsite, and I had a clear line of sight of the tree and the field behind it. As it was dark, Mike and Brian wanted to grab some wood for a campfire and asked me to begin setting up the tent. They wandered out of sight to my left. I was facing the trail, and I could hear them rummaging for firewood. I proceeded to dump the contents of the canvas tent onto the ground, bent over, and started gathering the tent poles, and my following action changed my life forever. I glanced at the oak tree on the other side of the wall. What I saw still haunts me today. A solid black figure peering at me from behind the oak tree on the other side of the stone wall. I could best describe it as a shadow, solid black, and non-translucent. I could see its upper body as it leaned out from behind the tree, and the shadowed-out hand on the front of it as if it were pulling itself out from behind. I was frozen with fear. That was the only time I have ever been frozen by anxiety. I stared at this thing for an eternity, however it couldn't have been more than 5 to 10 seconds. I didn't see this out of the corner of my eye, I was staring directly at it. Just then it slid back behind the tree, and instantly I heard Mike and Brian coming back toward me. I jumped up and yelled, Guys, get over here!" They came running and asked me what the matter was. I thought for a second, and was embarrassed to tell them what I had seen. I said, "There's someone behind that tree. I just saw someone behind that tree for sure." They both looked at me with a bit of a puzzled look, and Brian replied, "What are you talking about? We're in the middle of nowhere." I emphatically told them I had seen someone looking at me from behind the tree. We had been friends for many years, and they knew I was not going to scare very easy. Mike said, "All right, we charge the tree, Dave. You go right, and we'll go left." They pulled their K-knives out of their sheath they had on their belts, and I grabbed my pair of nunchucks. I was very much into the martial arts at the time, and had become very proficient with them as a weapon. We all three charged towards the trail, jumped the wall, and ran around the oak tree, but there was nothing. Nothing at all was there. There was no way anyone could have gotten away from there without us seeing them or hearing them. The tree stood alone. The ground was covered with leaves, and still there was no sign that anything had ever been there. They laughed and joked, blaming this on my first camping trip jitters and how I was just a bit shaken. I knew what I had seen though, and I had never been so scared in my whole life. But the night was just getting started, and all I wanted to do was go home. Night fell, and as they went about their camping rituals, starting the fire, getting out a pack of ground beef, and getting a pack of ground beef out that we had swiped from Mike's freezer to cook over the fire, I sat on a log quietly, terrified, still trying to process what I had seen earlier. We were there about 3 hours when we first heard something in the woods. Something was walking around our campsite just beyond the light of the campfire, maybe 20 to 25 feet in the darkness behind where Mike and Brian were sitting. I was the first to ask.
Guys, what is that?
Brian answered.
Probably just a deer.
I replied.
It definitely doesn't sound like a deer, it sounds like a person.
It didn't sound like an animal. It honestly sounded like a human being was walking in the woods, and they weren't even trying to be quiet about it. They both insisted it was probably just an animal attracted to the smell of the food. I knew in my heart it wasn't an animal, still keeping the secret of what I had actually seen earlier. As the night wore on and the animal continued to walk back and forth behind our campsite, I could see it was beginning to bother Brian and Mike. Brian stood up with his lantern, took a short run towards the rustling and yelled, "Ah!" in an apparent attempt to scare off whatever was harassing us. He sat back down, and within a few minutes, the sound of the crunching leaves and snapping twigs resumed. The harassment continued for another 30 minutes at the very least, and Mike and Brian were now eerily quiet and visibly shaken. Back and forth, they walked beyond our view, crunching and snapping of the leaves and everything else in between. It was about 10 minutes later, and all of us were sitting quietly, trying to act as if nothing was wrong, when Brian suddenly jumped up. He grabbed a piece of the wood he had collected. It was about 14 inches long and thicker than the average man's forearm. He threw the wood directly at the noise in the dark. We heard it hit the ground. Brian sat back down again and confidently said,
"That'll scare it away."
For a few short minutes it was quiet. Then just before we heard the walking in the leaves start up again. This time, it sounded like it only took a few steps and then stopped. We all sat there quietly, not knowing what to say, what to do, when all of a sudden we heard a whoosh of something cut through the air. The piece of wood Brian had thrown earlier came sailing over my head and hit the tree. I was sitting under this tree, and this was a strong blow because I felt the entire tree shake from the impact. It fell about 10 feet from me, so it must have bounced off a good way. I looked at Mike and Brian, who were white as ghost, and asked,
"Do deer throw logs?"
We all sat there for no more than a minute, and the noise began to start back up. Brian finally spoke up and said,
"We can stay here all night, and I won't get a wink of sleep. Or..."
Mike jumped in.
"Let's get the fuck out of here."
They jumped up and Mike asked me to kick dirt on the fire as Brian lit his lantern. Mike and Brian then proceeded to break down the tent, which amounted to them ripping it down and rolling it into a ball. They quickly stuffed the poles and canvas into the bags, and I finished putting out the fire. We paid no mind to whether the noise continued. We were focused solely on getting out of there. We stood all packed up and not looking forward to the long hike out in total darkness. Brian decided he should take the lead because he had the lantern. Mike would be second in line and I would have to bring up the rear. Mike and Brian drew their knives and Mike looked at me and said, "Dave, anything comes out of the dark, you crack it with those chucks." I slowly nodded, and we began to walk out. The wall was now on our right as we began to make our way through the darkness. The lantern really did not provide much light at all, and Mike and I were almost in complete darkness, just following the light in front of us. At first, there was a foot or two between us, and we had been walking for about 15 minutes when I thought I heard something. The trail was worn and had only a few leaves. I had heard what sounded like walking on leaves on the other side of the stone wall in the darkness. I grabbed Mike's belt and grabbed Brian. All three of us stopped and we all huddled together. They asked what was wrong and I whispered,
"I think I hear right there,"
and looked to my right, indicating the darkness on the other side of the wall. We stood motionless, all of us listening intently and noticing nothing. Mike said,
"Listen, we're all freaked out. Let's get out of here."
Brian and I nodded, and we began walking out. Again we walked another 10 minutes and I heard it again. This time I didn't stop. I leaned forward and whispered into Mike's ear,
"Listen."
We slowed our pace for just a few seconds when Mike said,
"Oh crap, I hear it."
Something was walking parallel to us on the other side of the wall. It was unmistakable, walking in the leaves and only about 5 feet from us in the darkness. Walking in the leaves and only about 5 feet from us in the darkness. It was right there, It was almost like it could jump over at any minute and grab us. Mike grabbed Brian, and we all huddled again. We both told him, "It's right there," and looked into the darkness over the wall. We stood still for a moment, and then all three of us heard something moving amongst the leaves. It was almost difficult to hear because my heart was pounding so hard. I thought it might explode out of my chest at any waking moment. I was experiencing pure terror for the first time in my life. Brian took his lantern and extended his arm over the wall, his knife in his other hand at the ready. We could now see about 10 feet on the other side of the border. All three of us stood there for a few seconds looking, and we could see absolutely nothing. Then we heard it again, the leaves moving on the ground. The sound was right there, but there was nothing we could see. Brian said, "Let's get out of here." And Brian started yelling that we should get out of here, and we still had about 40 minutes of walking ahead of us. We started walking again. The noise immediately started again. It kept pace with us, and it was apparent it wanted us to know it was there. Brian stopped and suddenly said, "Let's run as fast as we can for at least 30 seconds and stop and see what happens." We agreed, and off we went running as fast as our teenage legs would carry us. We stopped, out of breath, listened, and we heard it. Stomping in the leaves in the darkness on the other side of the wall, it was chasing us. We huddled together, ignoring the noise it was making more than a few feet from us in the dark. It sounded almost like pacing. Mike spoke first, asking, "What are we going to do?" Just then a sinking thought came to my mind, and I spoke up. "No one knows we're out here. We lied to everyone. They'll never find us." They both stared at me with blank expressions as the realization of how screwed we were sunk in. Brian said, "Listen, in 10 seconds, I'm gonna run out of here as fast as I can. Suppose you can keep up? Great. If not, I hope I see you tomorrow." With that, Brian was gone, and the only visible thing was the bouncing lantern moving through the forest. Mike and I followed the best we could. Mike was carrying the tent bag, and it was spilling its contents on the trail as we tried to keep up with Brian. We'd been stuck in the woods with no light source if we'd lost him. I tripped over the tent poles and the canvas tent, but never lost footing. We ran the entire way out, and when we reached the road, we all began throwing up. We snuck back into Mike's basement, and that's where we slept. Those two returned the next day to collect everything we dropped on the trail, and I declined to go with them. They went back the following weekend, getting prepared with tripwires, flashlights, and machetes to prove something I never did. Even though I grew up hiking around those woods, since then I have not spent a night in the woods and have no plans to ever venture into a forest again. I never told them what I saw, but I know what I saw, and nothing will change that fact. The Creature I Ran Into by Cowpoke. For starters, I was 17 years old when this happened. I'll try to remember what I can. I live on a ranch in West Texas that has belonged to my family for quite some time, many generations. It mainly contains cows and horses. I grew up southern, living outdoors and learning to be a rancher. Our ranch also has a large acre of woods. That's where I spent most of my life. I'm both a cowboy and a country boy. Anyhow, one day in the summertime, my parents were going up to France for a romantic vacation, and they'd be gone for a week, leaving me by my lonesome. So my dad left me in charge of being the man of the ranch. I know it's crazy for them to leave me alone for a week, but I guess I didn't mind since I know how to do the things around the ranch. I forgot to mention that I have 2 older siblings, my brother and sister, but they're grown and gone and live their own lives. My parents apparently trust me enough to look out for the place, and it made me feel good. On day 1, nothing really happened, since I spent most of the day doing chores, milking the cows, grooming the horses, and all the 9. On day 2, my girlfriend came in the afternoon, and we did many things together. Later that day, we went horseback riding out in the backwoods. But other than that, nothing really happened. But on day 3, that's when the encounters happened. I was sitting on the back porch on guard duty. I remember holding my dad's rifle in hand and listening to country music, but I thought I heard something over the music. I turned the music down and listened closely, but there was nothing there. It was getting late, so I rounded up the cows and horses in the barn, double-locked the doors, etc. I then felt uneasy, like something or someone was watching me from the woods. I turned around and saw a dark figure peeking out from one of the trees. I couldn't quite see what it was, since it was from some sort of distance. Couldn't tell you exactly how far, but pretty far, and all black blended in with the shadows at that point. But I could make out an arm, it might have been a trespasser. I had the rifle in hand, so I kept my finger on the trigger and said, "Hey, this is private property, and you are trespassing. Move along now, and nobody gets hurt." But that figure didn't move, and I'm not even sure it even understood me. I don't know if I blinked or hallucinated, because the next thing I remember, the figure was gone. Like it had just vanished into thin air. At that moment, I really didn't care about it, and I just wanted to go inside. So I went back inside, tried to calm down, played some Red Dead Redemption 2 with the volume down, and that's when the cows began to make a commotion. I ran out to the barn with my rifle, and when I got there, the barn door was smashed open. It looked like somebody had punched through it, and I saw where the cows had been killed and partly eaten. I almost threw up at the sight of it. It seemed that the attacker was gone before I showed up. I walked up to the carcass and muttered, "Damn it, what am I going to tell Pa?" I cared for the corpse, but I was mad at whatever attacked the cow. I wanted to go after this thing and kill it. So an idea came to my mind. I decided to take the carcass in the woods and use it as bait to draw this thing out. So the next day I got to work, tied the cow to the end of my buddy, and drove it into the woods. I found an excellent spot to lay. I also installed a hunting camera that can connect to my phone, so that if it does show up, I would get it on camera and potentially get a note. As I was installing it, I felt like I was getting paranoid, like something was about to pounce at me at any second, and every sound made me more and more cautious. The woods, which I thought were my safe place, have turned into a hunting ground. Once I was done, I headed back to the house and waited. While waiting, I remembered that dark figure I saw the other day. The two things are connected, I know they are, and we have yet to see a lot of deer or coyotes like we normally do. I then felt my phone vibrate. I took it out and saw the notification. There were pictures. And there it was, some sort of silhouette in the distance. The only way I can describe it is that it wasn't human or animal, but something in between. It looked to have a body like a man, but it looked like it never ate, or something like that. It was super emaciated looking. It had claws for fingers. Its skin looked like it had been burned or singed, and I could see the outline of its bone. Its head looked like some sort of animal skull with antlers sprouting out on top. It had many of them on its back. I know a lot of cryptids and the supernatural. When I saw this thing, I knew it had to be one thing and one thing only. It was a Wendigo. The last picture was more terrifying, as it looked like it was staring right through my soul with dark eyes. I turned off the phone for a second. I had two choices. One, go after this creature and try to make it go away. Or two, let it be and let it destroy my family's ranch. Ultimately, I chose to go after it because there was no way I would let this thing ruin our livelihood. I summed up the courage. With God on my side, I went out there and asked him to protect me. And so I made it into the woods. I was scared, of course, and I must be out of my mind to kill this thing alone. But who was I going to call, and who the heck would believe me? If it was as weak as I remember it being to fire, I think I might be able to take this over pretty easily. As I was walking down the trail, every noise made me jump. I had my rifle, but it didn't really make me feel very invincible, if you will. All of a sudden, everything went absolutely quiet. The sounds of the birds, the insects, everything was absolutely gone, and even the wind died down. I then smelled this horrible stench, like rotting meat and death. I knew it was here. I knew this was my time. I then heard something behind me. It was a voice. It sounded like my mom, but I knew it wasn't her. I gripped my gun and turned around, and there, it stood on its hind legs. We were staring at each other. It said something that I'll never forget.
"Run, boy."
This understandably sent a shiver down my spine. I snapped out of it and opened fire on it. It screeched in pain as every shot hit its torso. I kept shooting until I felt like it had enough, and it did. I saw that it had to be wounded pretty badly, if not mortally. It ended up running away. I was offended, but I was assuming it was going to run away and never come back. So I didn't chase it, and I never saw whatever this thing was again. Wendigo, skinwalker, whatever. Whenever I go into the woods, it seems more peaceful now, but I'm always on high alert. The fog in the cemetery. by Dirk F. I had a friend in high school named Drew, whose parents owned a fantastic house. It was huge with several rooms, a giant TV with surround sound, all the video games a kid could want, and a legit pool in the backyard. The kind of lion head fountain, built-in hot tub, and diving board with enough, room to actually dive type of pool. I had been friends with Drew since elementary school. He had moved away for a while but moved back during sophomore year, and we reconnected instantly. Drew's mom was super cool. She was one of those moms you always felt like you could talk to, and there was never any judgment. His sister Chelsea was excellent too. Truthfully, though, I was afraid to say so then. I had a massive crush on Chelsea and loved it whenever she would hang out with our friend group. One night, many boys got together at Drew's place to watch some movies, play video games, swim, and skateboard. We each consumed our weight in pizza that night. Also, we were all planning to stay the night. As it got darker and darker, the conversation went to ghost stories. Drew's mom overheard us, and having grown up in the area, she told us about a crazy night in her teen years when she and her friends visited an old cemetery and got sketched out. Long story short, we asked her if she could drive us to the cemetery. She figured it would be fun to relive that night as a grown-up who knew better, and she wanted to give us a good, fun scare we would never forget. Drew's mom, the boys, and Chelsea loaded into her Suburban, and we headed out there. The cemetery was around 8 miles northwest of our small western town. It was off in an old dirt county road and had been there for easily 130 years. It was surrounded by farmland and woods with no visible houses. One of the places where you are more likely to run into a coyote than a person. These days, not many people get buried out here, but many of the early settlers of our community are there. The cemetery has always had a creepy vibe, even in the day, but we could never really have anticipated what we would experience that night. It was already nighttime when I finally left the house, and the sky seemed strangely darker as we made our way to the cemetery. I remember having an oddly uneasy feeling. We pulled up to the gate, and it was surprisingly open. We decided to drive in. Drew's mom moved towards the back of the expansive burial ground, and something disturbing began to happen halfway through between the entrance and the back fence. It was a clear night, but suddenly, I swear to you, a thick fog began to form around us. This was followed by each of us getting cold. Remember, it was summertime in the western United States. It was easily 85 degrees or higher, and we all got chills simultaneously. We felt cold, and a sense of dread washed over us. One of the guys started to whimper and asked if we could leave. That's when the shadows around whatever gravestone we were sitting in front of began to dance. We thought it was just the shadow of a tree branch blowing in the wind at first, but then we saw the figure of a man move from a crouching position to standing. He was tall, easily 6'5". He was wearing what appeared to be corduroy pants with a striped shirt, suspenders, and what I could only guess was some sort of farmer's hat. The fog and chills had already thoroughly freaked us out. Seeing a guy standing up from behind a headstone in the middle of the old cemetery at night turned the creepiness factor to an 11 out of 10. We began to turn around to head out when Chelsea said, "Guys, do you see that dude's face?" We all turned to look, and to our horror, there was no face. Where a face should have been was blank. It was like he was a walking mannequin or something, and that was the final straw. Drew's mom put her accelerator to the floor, and we peeled out of there faster than anyone should ever drive through a narrow old cemetery, especially at night. To make the freaky situation a little bit more intense, the faceless man began to chase after us. It wasn't until we were entirely out of the cemetery and down the road that he stopped and stood there as if he was watching us with his eyeless face, ensuring we kept moving away from his hallowed domain. The fog lifted when the cemetery and our warmth returned. Our sense of security took much longer to produce, though. Through tears, Drew's mom apologized for taking us out there. To this day, I have never been back to that cemetery, and I don't think I ever will. Something is out there, and it doesn't want people around. On the bright side, I was sitting next to Chelsea in the Suburban on that horrifying night, and though I was scared, I was a stout football player type and happened to become the place where Chelsea turned for security in her fear. In my life, I hope I never again face anything as terrifying as I did that evening, but the long hug from Chelsea was 100% worth it. There's a Shadow Over My Bed by Dubiously Yours. I haven't been sleeping well lately. At first, I thought it was because my toddler's been insisting on sleeping in my bed, relegating her poor father to the living room sofa. She's a fitful sleeper, and often I end up with a little foot kicking me in the side or softly snoring face pressed into my neck. I don't mind it though. This is why I'm starting to think my lack of sleep isn't her, but rather this odd thing I see above me in the dark. Now, the room isn't completely void of light at night. My computer has a few small lights that pulse off and on even when powered down. It is very dim. Now, admittedly, these lights are dim and they only really do cast off a sort of glow, but that's when I see it. Up where the wall meets the ceiling is a shadow that vaguely resembles, well, it's like the shape of a body. As if someone is lying prone at the angle of the ceiling, somehow resting up there despite gravity. Part of the shadow curves out in a way that looks exactly like a person lifting their head while lying flat. I tried to show it to my husband, but he didn't see it. He thinks something in the room must be somehow casting off a shadow, but I can't figure out what would even remotely make that shape for the life of me. I get this unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach the longer I look at it. It's almost like the longer I look at it, the more the figure becomes clear. The more I almost think I see a face. I can't look at it anymore. It's virtually feeding off my attention. Like somehow me acknowledging that it's there is making it more real. This seems even more true because if I force myself to look away for some time, when I look back at it, it's suddenly much more vague. It's back to just being a shadow. It's been a few days now and it's still there. Well, not so much there as it almost seems like it's not on the ceiling anymore, now it's on the wall and it's closer. I never see it move, but I swear it's more intimate. I'm so scared to go to sleep. I'm laying here, staring up at it with my daughter's sleeping form at my side, and I think I see its face again. It has arms now, I see hands, and if I close my eyes, I'm hoping it will fade away. But I'm also scared if I force myself to open them again and look, that face will be inches away from my own. I can barely sleep, and I think I heard it move. If anybody in the swamp has any idea what this thing is, please, let me know. Almost Eaten Alive by I Can't See 5458. This story takes place when I was around 12 years old or so. I was visiting my cousin Tyler in South Carolina, ready to have the time of my life. He lives in endless woods surrounding his house. Once I arrived, he and I were prepared to explore the woods like we do every time. This time, though, we would explore somewhere that would haunt me for years to come. Now, it started like any other time, running around and pretending we hear monsters to scare each other. Our parents always had one rule about the woods, though, and that was not to cross the creek. We've always listened, but we explored every nook and cranny on our side of the stream. So we thought it would be okay to cross the creek just this one time. We'll be back before our parents even notice we're gone, I told Tyler. He said whatever, and we began our journey on new turf. After what felt like miles of walking, we came upon a house. It was abandoned because half the roof was caved in. This was like a dream come true to us. We've always dreamed of finding an abandoned house in the woods. So, of course, we explored the place. There wasn't really anything to study because the roof and floor were caved in. After that, we thought we should start heading back before our parents noticed we were gone. We climbed up this hill and could see a road in the distance. If we went to the road, we could follow it home instead of going through all the thorns and bushes in the woods. As we walked towards this road, the road is probably a good half-mile away, and we noticed two houses on our left and right. These were not abandoned because we could see cars, and the houses were in good condition. As we start walking past the left house, we hear a dog barking. Not really good with species, but it was some sort of Rottweiler mixed with something. This dog has these big chains around his neck that were used as a leash. This dog is barking very loudly at this point. We keep our distance and walk by the dog. The dog starts running towards us. Now, we were probably a quarter mile away from the dog, so we didn't do anything. We knew he was chained up. As we watched the dog bark and get closer and closer, we actually realized the dog isn't chained to anything. I turned to my cousin and told him we needed to run. We start to run as fast as our legs will carry us toward the road, hoping we can find a house to help us. As we run, we drop our backpacks and everything in our pockets. We began running full speed and can hear the dog barking and getting closer and closer before he is almost on our tail. As we make it to the road, we run to the closest house and start banging on the door until someone quickly opens it and let us in. I have no idea how the dog didn't catch up with us, but we didn't notice he stopped at the grass line before we got onto the road. It's a miracle we didn't get hurt or anything. We never crossed the creek again and always stayed on our part of the creek. The Brown Mountain Lights Are Real by Anonymous. The Brown Mountain Lights in North Carolina are real, and you can Google it. I found it because I was seeing lights in our woods by my home. We live on 10 acres on the side of a mountain. The house is at the top. Below us are 3 homes and 1 lot without a house with 10 to 20 acres each. All wooded, and the owners are only there on weekends or very few days a week. The only entry to the plots is a private road that cuts through the land by our house. I often sit outside, so I usually see our neighbors coming in and out. It is so frequent that I will maybe see 1 car or truck come by during the week. I've seen lights in our woods that just don't make sense. This is remote, so I'd hear the motor of an ATV or some sort of truck. Especially if it was coming from somewhere else, because you can't even reach this place from any other neighborhood, you know? There's a river at the bottom, and then there's an old logging road that is entirely blocked by a huge tree and a ditch dug out to prevent anyone from going on that overgrown path. So these lights really shouldn't be existing up here. I have driven the road very close to where these lights usually form, and it doesn't make sense, because where I'm seeing them is in the middle of dense trees and foliage. There is no line of sight to my house from that road, only about a mile straight downhill from the heavy woods. I have determined some of the lights may have been a neighbor or two walking in their driveway to visit other neighbors or taking animals for walks or something like that, but sometimes there really is no explanation. It's so quiet, and literally in the fall I hear leaves falling, and I can always hear the crunch of a truck or anything with a motor. If it's driving on our road, I'm gonna hear it. So I'll see the lights and there'll never be noise. Again, it's so quiet I can hear squirrels, turkeys, deer walking through, especially in autumn or winter with the leaves on the ground. Some other details is typically 1 light, not 2 headlights, and not a bunch of lights like a group of people. It will move horizontally and not float down like most of the Brown Mountain Light sightings. It's pretty bright, like a giant flashlight or 1 headlight, and I don't really know exactly how more to explain it. It's pretty creepy, mainly because it'll float and it'll get pretty close to our home and then just disappear entirely. So if it is somebody walking with a flashlight, I'm almost positive I would hear their footsteps. If anyone has any idea as to what I could potentially be seeing, let me know in the comments. Camping at a park was a bad idea. By Bama Girl. This happened back in 2012, in Florida. I was 22 at the time and my ex was 19. We both had fallen on tough times and ended up becoming homeless. We had no choice but to pitch a tent in the woods and do our best to survive. We lived in that tent for about 1.5 years. Unfortunately, during this time we both became addicted to meth. I know, not a great story, right? It's not the best background, but it happened and there's nothing we can do about it, and there is no sugarcoating addiction. We had been living in our tent for about 6 months at this point, and our little tent had become a pretty impressive home base that we entirely built by tweaking. We ended up with 3 tents with a screened-in area to keep the mosquitoes out. There was a park about 1/2 mile away from our camp. And every evening, different churches would come to visit this park and feed the homeless. So one evening, my ex and I went to this park to get food. We had been awake for about 5 days at this point and were coming down, so we needed food and a lot of rest. We ended up meeting a couple at the park, and they were about our age, maybe a few years younger. They joined us at our table and told us their story and how they ended up homeless. They told us they had no tent and nowhere to go. So my ex elbowed me in the ribcage and gave me the eyes. So I asked them if they wanted to stay in our extra storage tent. They took us up on the offer, being incredibly grateful. After all, we were all homeless and we needed to take care of each other. Once we were all done eating, we packed up our leftovers and started to head back to the home base. Our little setup seemed to impress the couple when we reached the tents. I grabbed some dry wood with the boy and set up a small fire in the makeshift fire pit. We sat around the fire talking and laughing for a couple of hours, and we got to know each other better. Soon the fire turned to a smoldering ember, and we decided to go to bed. I gave them some extra pillows and blankets, and we all said goodnight. I was lying in my tent in and out of sleep. It was an hour after everybody said goodnight, and at this point, I was almost delirious from the amount of time I had been awake. Then I heard a loud smacking sound. It woke me up pretty quickly. I was a bit confused because I didn't hear any voices, so I thought it must have been my imagination at first. So I laid back down, and then I heard it again, but this time much louder, and this time followed by the sound of a zipper. I can hear the girl at the door of my tent pleading to come in, so I opened and invited her in. Of course I'm annoyed, but it is what it is. I gave her a pillow, then I hear the zipper in the tent once again. Now the boy is at the front of my tent, screaming at the girl to come out of my tent. She refused. So what does this guy do? He unzips my door, grabs her by the hair, and rips her out of my tent. I'm no saint, and I won't be someone to say that I have never manhandled or put my hands on my exes in any sort of situation, especially in the worst of my addiction. But that night I didn't have the patience to deal with these two, and I was not about to stand by and watch this girl get beat down by someone 3 times her size. I jumped to my feet and bum-rushed the guy. I had no advantage over him at all. In all actuality, I was the same size as the girl, but I was no stranger to fights myself. I grew up with 5 brothers. Being the only girl, they ensured I knew how to defend myself. I made contact with the boy. He didn't see me until it was far too late, luckily. He was instantly on his back, but he got up rather quickly, and I suffered one of the worst beatings of my life. I kept pushing him away, trying not to get hit, and I just kept myself between him and the girl. This kid was throwing haymakers at me over and over. Every time I hit the ground, I would get back up, and he moved from my face to my ribs. But still, I would not let him get to the girls. He struck me, I wouldn't get back up. I was just bloody and battered at this point, knowing I had some broken ribs. If things got any worse, I would probably die. And that's when I heard a screaming from the girl, who was trying to protect me from the continuous kicks to the ribs. This idiot pulls out brass knuckles that double into a pocket knife. The kid punched my ex in the chest, flipped open the blade, and tried to cut her. I saw the red come through her shirt, and I blacked out. The rest of the story is a recounting through my ex's words. I sprang to my feet and was super quiet. I looked at my ex, saw the wound. Thank goodness it wasn't anything more than a surface wound, and I started walking around. I started to the side and found a log big enough to make an impact and small enough to basically be like a softball swing. I ran behind him, looked down, and stomped a stick to get his attention. I made him look at me as I softball swung at his head. He immediately crumpled to the ground. The girls were trying to make me stop at this point, but I jumped on top of him, grabbed the remaining log pieces, and repeatedly struck him in the head. I apologize if that is graphic. Once the log was nothing but splinters, I got off him, he was unconscious, and I grabbed the claw hammer from the front of my tent. I grabbed the hammer and started to scream in a demonic voice. It was almost unintelligible. I made my way to the guy, turned the hammer claw in. I raised the hammer, and as I was mid-swing, only inches from his temple, both of the girls grabbed my arm and disarmed me. They didn't let me kill him, and I thank them all the time for that. My rage just took over. I don't even know how to explain it. There was nothing they could do for my ribs. There was nothing they could do for my rib fractures, my skull fracture. Everything was only going to be healing in time, essentially. There was nothing the hospital was going to be able to do for it. So, instead of killing this guy, I just called the police. We waited for them to come pick him up. An EMT took me to the hospital. and I got bandaged up. We never saw that couple again, and for days after that I could barely walk as the pain was unbearable. Unfortunately, I can't really say that after this experience I was on my way to recovery. But I would get there eventually, of course. But it was the biggest eye-opening thing in my life.
The Park That Rained Rocks by Heavy Metal Barbie. This happened a few months ago. My friend, who is 23 years old and a male, and I, who is 22 years old and a female, were hanging out one Sunday afternoon. Since it was a lovely sunny day and it was near the end of fall and the cold winter was fast approaching, we decided to go to a bar or a cafe. We would get some beers and relax at the park to soak up one of the last sunny days that we would get that year. We bought some beer and snacks at the store and decided to sit on a bench at the park nearest to the store because we didn't want to walk too terribly far. The area I live in is known for having many beautiful gardens, almost next to every block of buildings. The park was tiny to give you a general idea of our surroundings. A few benches were next to a child's playground, and a basketball court was a little bit down the road. Buildings surrounded the park for the most part. Most of the area was covered in grass, but the garden was built so underneath the swings and slides there were tiny white rocks, little, but they were rocks nonetheless. We were the only people there for easily 10 or 20 minutes. None of the other benches were occupied, no other kids were on the playground, it was just peace and quiet. Suddenly, we noticed this man running extremely fast in our direction. At first we didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just running after his dog or something of the like. So we kept minding our business. Suddenly, he stopped abruptly as soon as he got to the playground. Now, I was a bit confused at this point, but very quickly my confusion turned into fear when I saw this man pick up a handful of rocks and throw them everywhere while making bizarre grunting noises and screaming. I looked over at my friend and told him that I wanted to leave immediately. This guy was twacked out of his mind. He said he wasn't sure if this was a good idea since the man had not noticed us yet. And if we just got up and left, he could see us and decide to attack us. We sat there for a few more minutes watching this man, hoping he would go and not notice us. But, to our luck, of course he noticed us. And as soon as he saw us, he ran exceptionally quickly, got very close to our faces, and started flailing his arms at us, still making these weird grunting noises. We just looked at each other, quickly grabbed our stuff and tried to get up. When the man noticed that he stood before me, blocking me from moving, he grunted in my face very loudly. His breath smelled like absolute crap. I was so scared, not knowing what to do. I am not much of a fighter, and neither is my friend. This man was indeed way more potent than us. I seriously considered just putting my cigarette out on his arm to distract him and free myself from the trap he had put me in. My friend got up and took a step toward him in an attempt to scare him off. Luckily this worked and the man backed off a bit, just enough so I could get up and escape. As soon as I got up, we started running away as fast as we could, hoping we wouldn't be chased after. As we were running, I noticed rocks around us raining down because the man had started throwing them at us in handfuls. Luckily, none of us got hurt and we were able to get out of there unharmed. We had a few scratches and bruises, both of us were pretty shaken up after that, and we never knew exactly what his intentions were. However, we both concluded that it was pretty clear that he had some mental problems and was probably twacked out on some drugs. The Creepy Trail Guy, a Swamp Dweller classic story reread, by Deadly Images. I'm a 20-year-old female, and I live in Michigan. I was 16 years old when these events happened. I am a substantial athletic nerd and go hiking on a daily basis, unless I'm feeling lazy that day. Unfortunately, I picked the wrong day to go hiking, and I met and experienced something I would not want to share or ever experience again. I wouldn't even put this on my worst enemy. I drove to my typical hiking trail. I go there just about every time I go hiking, and this day I saw a creepy guy who looked to be in his early to mid-30s. Me being stubborn and hard-headed, I just decided to ignore them and continue jogging on the trail anyway. Typically, if you see somebody acting weird in a parking lot, especially to a trail or somewhere outdoorsy, definitely have a friend with you or at least some sort of protection. You never know what their intentions are. I took a short glance at him and started going on to the path. I got 200 to 300 yards away from the entrance and took a short break until I heard a scream. It sounded like a man was absolutely losing his mind, and then I looked down the path and my heart dropped. I saw the same guy from before in the parking lot running straight towards me, screaming. My adrenaline rushed into me, and I began to run as fast as I possibly could. This guy ran so fast that he caught up with me in no time, and I was a speedy runner. The guy ran like he had taken 2 shots of steroids and was a straight bat out of hell. I started to cry in panic, freaking the heck out. I quickly turned into the woods and returned to the parking lot area. I kept hearing his footsteps not too far behind me. As I kept running, the footsteps started to get slower, and I eventually was losing him. Once I made it to the parking lot and had any sense of safety again, I jumped into my car, locked all the doors, and immediately called the cops on my cell phone. Not very long after, they arrived and searched the entire area. They did eventually find the man. He was a homeless man. He was 37 years old, and they found a very big, rusted butcher knife in one of his coat pockets. I'm glad I did ROTC throughout high school, or else I would not have had the energy to be able to outrun him. He was faster than me, but my stamina was overall better. This is a short, creepy story, but it forever lives on inside of me.
What park rangers in the Great Smokies won't tell you. By Horror Writer 1717. I was a park ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. It wasn't a bad job. The scenery was amazing. I loved to drive up Klingman's Dome overlook and watch the sunrise. Anytime there was a thunderstorm, I headed for that overlook. One of the best things about the job is the autonomy. Being left alone to do whatever you want is kind of excellent, but it doesn't come without its downside. This park is massive, over 1 million acres, and 11 million people visit annually. I found out the hard way why the park closes at night though. If you've never driven through the Great Smokies on a cloudy, moonless night, you've never experienced true soul-crushing darkness. Do you know those extremely bright LED lights that so many trucks have on the front of their grille blind you when they drive towards you? Yeah, our trucks don't have those. We have regular lights, the old, dull yellow glow. The ones that make you wonder if your battery is going dead or if you'd be better off shining a flashlight ahead of you because you would probably see more that way. The AM radio in the Ranger truck spews out static-filled country garbage. It would be easy just to turn it off, but sometimes I feel like it's my only company, the endless black ribbon of road that runs through this sea of darkness. One thing this job gives you plenty of is time to think, and sometimes that's not always a good thing. I slam on my brakes to avoid hitting a deer. It glances at me, then continues to strut across the road in no hurry.
You're welcome!
I yell out my window. The deer doesn't even pause. I swear the animals around here think they own the place. I think that with a chuckle. Just to make my life more interesting, it starts to snow. In ordinary places, that's not much of a problem. In this pitch black mountain, it could quickly become an issue. It usually doesn't snow here, but there's a call for concern when it does. Most times it's a freak occurrence and comes fast and heavy. This time is no exception. Within minutes the road is covered. Already low visibility has been reduced to nearly zero. And of course it starts when I'm furthest away from the station, right in the middle of nowhere. I slow to a crawl, knowing it will take me forever to get back, but at least I'll get there in one piece instead of sliding off a mountain to my fiery, gory death. I hope. I turn on my windshield wipers in a futile attempt to keep visibility. They work almost as well as the radio, honestly. The defroster and the wipers fight a losing battle against the onslaught of snow. I would just pull over and wait it out, but out here I don't want to end up buried in snow for days waiting for someone to come plow me out. Each station has one snow plow. I don't remember when it was used last. Suddenly I look out the front of the truck and remember that I am actually driving the only truck with the mount for the plow. Translation: I need to get back because there's no one coming to get me. As that positive thought rattles through my head, I come to a turn I see just in the nick of time. I have just enough time to wrench the wheel hard to the right and stay on the road. My tires and the deepening snow disagree on which way the truck is going, and I end up sliding toward the edge. I jump on the brakes in a panic, causing them to join the direction argument. In the end, momentum wins. I slide closer to the rail that I know won't keep me from diving hundreds of feet to my death. I'd love to say that my life flashed before me, but all I could do was see that damn snow. I'm going to die surrounded by irritatingly blinding white snow. With nothing else to do, I close my eyes and pray. Time slows as I begin to bargain with my maker. The usual stuff: I'll be better, I'll give my life to the church, I'll become a priest, a missionary, whatever you freaking want as long as you save my life. I felt a heavy thump. This is it, I think. I'm going over the edge. As a desperate last-ditch thought, I opened my door and threw myself out into the road. I land hard, like a belly flopper on asphalt. The wind escapes my chest and refuses to come back. I lay there rocking back and forth in the cold on the white road, hoping that, by some bizarre twist of fate, someone else doesn't come along and run me over. Seconds turn to minutes as I lay there watching the snow in its relentless downpour, waiting for my breath to return. Eventually, I come around and painfully rise to my feet. The truck sits idling as if nothing has happened. I reach in and put it in park, feeling embarrassed and stupid for getting myself in such a panic. I grab my flashlight and go to the front of the truck to see the damage. I'm surprised to find the front bumper sitting 4 feet from the rail. I know I hit something, I say to myself, examining the fence and finding it undamaged. I turn the light to my bumper and find it's been bent slightly at the end. My light flashes back and forth between the entire guardrail and the damaged bumper. What the hell? As my brain wraps around this puzzle, another piece falls into place. I see patches of hair on the bumper and red in the snow. As I pursue the matter, I know the imprint of a large animal lying in the snow in front of my truck is probably not the best idea to investigate. I pull out my phone and take a picture. The impression it made was massive. This thing is at least as tall as the car is vast, even more significant. Great, I hit a bear, I say sarcastically. I sigh as I see the trail of red heading off into the trees beside the road. Guess I should go check on it. I return to my truck, grab my coat and the keys, then head after my quarry. The red is becoming difficult to track through the deepening snow. The tracks themselves seem odd. They're too close together. It's almost like as if this bear is walking on its hind legs. But why would it do that? Did it hurt its paw or something? I approach the edge of the woods, still following the red tracks. I don't want to go too far into the woods. I'm hoping I can catch a quick glimpse of the bear alive and well, looking a paw, but otherwise okay. Trekking through the dark woods in a snowstorm isn't part of the plan to keep me alive long enough to retire. As I follow the tracks further, I notice something else about them. They don't look like bear's tracks. If I would say they look like anything, I'd say more like large dog tracks. But they're way too big to be any normal dog I've ever seen. Even for a Malamute or a St. Bernard, these are massive. I step into the woods, not intending to go much further, and flash the light around a little bit. I notice the path continues going slightly uphill. Nope, I say. Not tonight. I turn and head back to the truck when I hear a low, guttural growl. I slowly turn around and see red glowing eyes staring at me from behind a tree. I shine the light in the direction and see that there are tracks that lead right up to a tree that hides all but the eyes of this creature. It's massive. The eyes must be 8 feet off the ground. I've never seen anything like this, and I still haven't seen it. Just the eyes at this point. In my terrified stupor, I do the least likely thing possible. I pull out my phone and take a picture. The flash makes it blink, but also appears to make it even more angry. It starts toward me. I would love to say that I was calm, relaxed, and collected as I returned to my vehicle and was on my merry way, but that didn't happen at all. I screamed and turned to run, but my boots were slippery and I fell, nearly hitting my head on a rock. As I gain traction and speed, I hear heavy footsteps behind me. No need to turn and look, I know it's coming after me. Oh dear God, oh dear God, oh dear God, oh dear God. I know I'm not going to make it. I do the one thing I don't want to do. I glance back. A massive mound of fur is galloping toward me, its red eyes glowing with malice. It's coming so fast that it'll overtake me at any second. No matter how fast I try to go, there's no way I'm going to get to my truck. My panicked mind runs through a myriad of options. From just give up to turn and command it to stop to throw the flashlight hoping it will fetch it and give you time to get inside the car. The moment of truth arrives. I'm almost to the truck, but I can feel its hot breath going down my neck at this point. I'll never make it around the corner. I'll try to think back to all those dinosaur movies I've seen and how they escaped. My mind reminds me that many of them ended up as a dino snack before the film was done. I sarcastically thanked my brain for the happy thought and chose the one tactic that the movies always seem to show to be successful. I slid under the truck. I'm barely on the ground until I hear a loud bang. The car lurches to the side. A massive snout shoves itself far under the truck as it can, and it sniffs. I try to ease my way out from under the car, but the nose disappears and reappears on the other side. This time there are also claws pawing at me, trying to get a hold of me. I shimmy away from them only to have them show up on the other side. Back and forth we go, like a demented seesaw. Front, back, sides, wherever I go, it's right there trying to grab me. After an eternity of this game, it tries something new. The paws disappear and I feel the truck springs compress. It's climbed on top of the truck. Shoot, now can see no matter where I go. I test my theory by shining my flashlight toward the back of the truck. It instantly appears and tries to shove its snout under, snapping at me. I push further toward the front. It returns to its vanguard on top of the truck. I lay as still as possible for an eternity, trying not to move, barely breathing, hoping it will lose interest in me and return to the woods. My waiting game ends when I realize the snow is almost up to the level of the truck's frame. I'm going to lose visibility soon. I know I need to do something. I come up with a desperate and stupid plan. I shine my light at the back of the truck, causing the creature to jump down and claw at me. At the same time, I dig some snow away from the front of the car to regain visibility. Then I do the same in reverse. I shine the light at the front and dig at the back. Next, I execute the most desperate and stupid part of my plan. I threw the lit flashlight toward the front of the car and it bounces near the guardrail, and for a moment it looks like it's going to hit and bounce back. I freeze in fear as it takes one more bounce, then disappears over the side. The creature leaps down but doesn't shove its snout under the truck. It jumps the guardrail and disappears. I gasp in astonishment that my plan has worked. I lay there and marveled for a second. Then my mind kicks my ass. What the hell are you still lying here for? Get in the truck! I jump up, hitting my head on the car's underside, then roll up on the driver's side, yank on the door, and of course it's locked. I fumble with my keys just like I've seen in every horror movie ever. I wondered how those people could suddenly forget how to use a key, and now I know. After several failed attempts, I finally opened the door and threw myself inside. I started it up, slammed it into reverse, and hit the gas and nearly did a complete 360 as the tires fight for traction in the snow that has accumulated around. I take a deep breath and compose myself before giving it a little gas, just enough to get moving and get myself back on the road. This leads me to my next problem. The road is gone. All that remains is a blanket of white. Sweat forms on my brow as I start down the road, steering by measuring the distance of the trees to the bank spot that used to be a road. I crawl down the mountain this way, slowing to a near stop whenever there is a curve. Unfortunately, it's the Smoky Mountain, so it's all curves. An hour later, I'm no closer to the station. However, a minor miracle happens. The snow stops. I'm so ecstatic I'm nearly jumping in my seat. I might even make it home alive. I glanced in my rear view mirror and those hopes are dashed instantly. In the distance, I see glowing red eyes, and they are getting closer. My veins turn to ice as I press down on the accelerator. After sliding through a turn, barely remaining in control of the vehicle, I realize I can't outrun it. I slow, but only a little bit. On the few straight spots in the road, I speed up but then slow down when I get to a curve. Consecutive stretches are the only time I can afford a glance in the mirror. Each time I do, the eyes are still there and they are a bit closer. I inch closer to the station, clinging to the desperate hope that I can make it there before this thing catches and devours me. I look at my odometer and realize I'm only 5 miles from the station. It might as well be 1,000,000. I sigh as I look back and see the eyes have become considerably more significant. There's a sharp turn coming up. I know I have to slow down for it. I know that things will catch up when I do. I also know there's a steep drop-off at this turn. I'm stuck. No matter what I do, it's going to end badly. I do what has to be done. I slow down enough to keep from sliding off the edge. When I straighten out, I glance back and the eyes are gone. Could it have slipped off the edge? My hopes rise and then suddenly plummet as I see the red eyes beside me. The monster is running beside the truck. It slams into the door, making a considerable dent. It hits again and shatters the window. Its snout dives in and snaps at me. As the snarling, snapping jaws of death inch closer, I duck into the passenger seat. I do the only thing I can think of. I slam on the brakes. The unprepared monster goes flying forward as I slide to a stop. It shakes itself and stands, growling at me and baring its teeth. I jump on the gas pedal to get as much speed as possible to run it over. The truck leaps in the air as the tires pass over the massive monster. I don't slow down until I have to. After I make it through the curve, I look back and don't see the glowing eyes. I hazard a glance out the window and see nothing but snow. I can't trust the quiet. I'm so paranoid, I'm shaking, and at this point I think I'd rather see the blasted beast just to know where it was rather than this ungodly suspense. After a few minutes and many more glances back, I finally let myself relax. I'm only a mile away from the station, and I can't believe I made it. The truck explodes from impact. I feel like a bulldozer has rear-ended me. I wrestle with the steering wheel as I'm hit again. The car is moving faster even though I'm standing on the brakes. I look back and see the monster. It's pushing me. I look forward and see the guardrail crumple underneath my front bumper. The truck slides over the edge. It's not the steepest ravine in the park, but it doesn't need to be. The car falls end over end, then starts turning and rolling. It all happened so quickly, I never took the time to fasten my seatbelt. I'm thrown around like a rag doll. By some miracle, I stayed inside the truck. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but I woke to heavy footsteps and snarling. I'm lying sideways under what's left of the back seat. The truck is on its roof, and I'm lying in a puddle of glass and blood. The monster sticks its snout through the shattered window and leers at me with its glowing red eyes. I try to crawl away, but my leg is bent at an unnatural angle, probably broken. Pain shoots through me as I try to use my arm to push out. Ultimately, I realize there's no escape. No fight left in me. I lay there and waited for the inevitable. It sniffs at me and drool drips from its mouth as its putrid breath assaults me. This is it. I close my eyes and wait. Nothing happens. I open my eyes and it's gone. I painfully turn to see if it's playing some game, but I can't find it. "What the hell happened to you?" says one of my fellow rangers as he sticks his face into the window. "How?" is all I can manage. "Looks like you're about to be the luckiest son of a bitch I've ever seen," he says. "You must have rolled off the road up there and landed on this road down here. A few more feet and you would have been headed for another tumble." I lay there waiting for something else to happen. This is a dream, I think. I'm dreaming of being rescued while the monster chews me into pieces. "Let's get you to a hospital," the ranger says. I wake up in a hospital bed. My right arm and left arm are each in a cast. It hurts to breathe. I'm pretty sure there are some broken ribs. The door opens, and another ranger steps inside. "I see they got you all fixed up," he chuckles. "What happened to you out there? Did you fall asleep at the wheel?" I think about what I should tell him. I wonder how much he would believe, and then I remember. "Phone," I rasp. He reaches into the pocket and pulls out his phone. I shake head painfully. "No, my phone." He searches through my bag with all my clothes and pulls out my phone with several cracks on the screen. "Pictures," I rasp. He opens the screen and navigates to the pictures. He looks at the last one and says, "Well, ain't that something?" he says. I'm so glad he sees it. I can tell my story and have proof of everything I see. He turns the phone towards me. All I see in the picture is white. The flash was on. The snow wiped out the monster's image. He scrolls back to the other view of the creature's imprint, but the flash in the snow also washes it out. I'm devastated. I know what I saw and I know it's real. Isn't it? I turn away. "I'll let you go so you can rest up," he says, then walks out the door. I'm not crazy, I saw it. A month later, I'm feeling a lot better. My arm and leg and ribs are all on the mend. I filled out my accident report. I didn't mention anything about a creature. My slipping caused a crash of the snowy road, and that's how I left it. I wish I could say that I've improved mentally, that I have had less nightmares, but I don't look out the window every night and see glowing red eyes staring back at me from the woods. But I can't say that, because it would be a lie. I know it's going to hunt me down one day. I know it's waiting for me.
A Boating Nightmare by Anonymous. This particular story is possibly the most traumatic week of my life. Sounds dramatic, I know. I'm already questioning whether or not I even want to put this out there. My name is Kira. I had a lot of issues with my parents growing up, but they always seemed to trump my feelings of uncertainty with annual trips to the Caribbean. Being from Canada, I always enjoyed the palm trees and vibrant aquamarine of the sea, but mostly, I enjoyed the week-long break from the bullies at my elementary school. I felt lucky. I knew I had an opportunity many kids in my class did not. More than anything, though, I was just happy to have something good in my life.
My parents were the type to take me on vacation, give me beers at the age of 10, and tell me about all the crazy stuff they did growing up. However, I was not allowed to have male friends, I was physically abused for the minor mistakes that I made, and my emotional needs were ignored. It's not relevant to the story, so I won't go into much more detail. But I was left with the impression that I constantly needed to impress and suck up to my parents if I wanted their love and attention, especially my dad. I tried so hard for him. I try to impress him to this day, but I can't help it. My parents took me to the Dominican Republic during March break for this particular vacation. I was 7 years old and this was my first trip overseas. We stayed at a resort on the waterfront of a popular tourist spot. We spent most of our days there on the beach. I was a fantastic swimmer and loved the water at the time. You had to drag me out of it practically. Nothing could break my spirit, nothing could scare me, I thought. I always considered my parents to be somewhat responsible. They were so strict I just thought it was because they were trying to protect me and do what was best. Looking back though, I get angry at how wrong I was. On the second day of our trip, my father walked me down to the beach. From what I can remember, we ended up at a boat rental area. They had kayaks and other small boats, what they called kayaks I guess, but these weren't kayaks. They were more like paddle boards. They were primarily flat and you sat on them rather than in them. My dad essentially told me to get the kayak and be safe, and don't mess around with the paddleboard. While dragging me out in one of these kayaks and pushing me into the water, a young girl around my age approached me, asking if she could join. I was practically conditioned into subservience, so I allowed it. We rode around in the shallow waters until she noticed some big waves out on the horizon. She insisted we go out there. I was scared, and I knew it was dangerous and a bad idea. But I've never had anybody convince me of doing something I didn't want to do, really. So, against my better judgment, we rode out there. And slowly but surely we approached waves taller than the two of us combined. We immediately realized our predicament and attempted to turn around, but it was far too late. A 10-foot wave flipped our tiny boat and flung us into the sea. The waves crashed over me repeatedly. All I could do was see the bottom of the ocean for a while. I remember thinking it was beautiful. I couldn't stay though. I had to do something. The waves were still coming at me with my head finally above the water. I couldn't see anything over them, and I felt myself dragged beneath. Finally I saw the girl. I hated her, and I didn't want to help her. Then I saw the boat. Both were maybe 20 feet away in opposite directions. I swam harder than ever towards the ship. Tears were streaming down my face. I eventually got us back onto the kayak, and our oars were nowhere in sight. We used our arms to paddle us forward, and after some time, what felt like an hour, maybe even more, we were back in the calmer waters, where we found one of our missing oars. We used it to get back to shore as quickly as possible. Upon arriving on the beach, we both ran back to our parents. At least I assume that's where she went, as we never saw each other again. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. Even after relaying that and all of what happened to my parents, they didn't seem to even get the hint that I should be supervised. I wasn't a bad kid, but as a 7-year-old in a foreign country, you'd think they'd be more cautious. A couple of days later, I walked down to the beach by myself, where an older gentleman approached me. He had a strange accent and asked me how old I was. I told him, though I was genuinely creeped out by him. I felt like I had to answer his questions. He was an adult and was therefore in charge. He then asked me if I would hang out with his son, Frederick. I still was nervous, but I reluctantly said yes. I was scared of this man, but at the same time I wanted another kid to play with as I was lonely. He took me to him, who to his credit was real. I hadn't been tricked or lured, and all my worries instantly melted away. Frederick and his father were visiting from Poland, and Frederick and I bonded, talking about our home countries, interests, and absent parents. I then learned that Frederick was 13. This concerned me though, not as much as it should have probably. Being only 7 years old, I knew that he was what was considered at my school a big kid. When you're a kid, a 6-year difference really is a lot. It feels like they have as much control over you as an adult. But we got along great, so I had no reason to think of him as anything other than a friend. We continued to hang out for several days. We would meet up at a specific spot on the beach, and we would talk and play in the sand. We never really went in the water. We would chat and explore the coast. It was a lot of fun. I liked Frederick. On the third day we met up, we played around in the sand. By this point, I noticed his father was never around. I had only ever seen him the first day when he approached me alone. I didn't think much of it. Frederick suggested we go into the water. As someone who loved the ocean, I was more than happy to oblige. I was honestly waiting for this. I loved the sand, but I wanted to swim. We went in the water, talking and laughing, except he kept moving further and further out to sea until I eventually couldn't touch the bottom. He was more than a foot taller than I was, so I assumed he didn't realize I couldn't feel him anymore. But then, his whole demeanor changed. We were facing each other. I was facing the shore, and he was facing the open ocean. He was blocking my path back to the beach, though this wasn't a concern at the time, until he started acting weird. Nothing leading up to this point would have led me to believe he was a threat. He asked me about my body and if I had ever seen a guy's private parts. Thinking this was a joke, I said no. He then asked me if my parents knew where I was. I once again stupidly said no. I was getting worried out, and I told him I wanted to go back to the beach. He ignored me, and then he asked, "Do you want to see it?" Surprisingly, at this point, I actually kinda knew what was going on, and I wasn't being an idiot for once. I tried to swim past him, but he grabbed my arm before I could say anything. He put both hands on top of my head and shoved me underwater. I was kicking and screaming, knowing no one could hear me or save me. I felt so helpless. I felt like I was leaving my body. I could see his legs, I could see the empty blue, I could see my parents lying on lounge chairs half a mile up the beach, sun-tanning, drinking cocktails, not a worry in the world. Anger consumed me. I was a good swimmer. I was in martial arts. I knew I could do better. I deserved a chance at life. I wanted my freedom so severely I kicked and kicked and kicked, and I kicked Frederick right in the jewels by pure chance. I somehow made it back to shore by grasping for air and swimming like I was in the Olympics. I ran to my parents, and though they questioned why I was out of breath, all I could say was, I never want to see Frederick again. And I didn't. During the last couple of days of the trip, my parents looked out for me. They never even questioned my decision to stop seeing this kid who they'd never even met. I put it out of my mind, too. I'm 24 years old now. I recently brought it up to my mother, telling her the whole story. She cried. I get it. I love my parents. Unfortunately, they didn't start paying attention to me until I no longer needed it.
Something is watching my cabin. By Anonymous. I have not told anybody online about this story. I have been watching your channel for quite some time and thought this would be the perfect place to share it. So, when I was about 13 years of age, I visited my grandparents in a cabin in the woods for quite a few days. Things were going completely normal, and my grandpa went out to get deer corn to leave out so we could take pictures of them in front of the cabin. A lot of deer came throughout the day, and it was at night that something I will never forget happened. It was sometime around 11 p.m. when I went outside to put out more corn. A large group of deer emerged from the trees when I stepped near the woods. They all looked fine except for one of them. One of them looked completely different. It was abnormally large, about 2 feet taller than the rest. It had no ears or antlers, and its eyes looked like it was glowing a strange yellow. Then it stood up on its hind legs, pacing back and forth, making weird noises, almost like a whistle mixed with a deep barking sound. I got so scared that I chucked the rest of the corn in my hand at it, then quickly ran inside. I went into the cabin's raised porch to see what it was doing, but it stopped pacing and stood there, looking at me and barking. I slept in the cabin's basement, which was pretty cozy. It had a pool table, a TV, a dinner table, and a couch, with 2 bedrooms. I locked the doors and stayed awake all night out of fear. It was gone by morning, but I was still pretty terrified. Me and my grandparents booked it out of there after I told them what happened. They were sleeping at the time, so I didn't bother waking them up. I'm surprised they actually believed me. It indeed was a terrifying experience, and to be honest, I'm still a little shaken up from this.
My Encounter with Wood Spirits by Anonymous. This happened to me while working in a factory on the border of Kansas and Missouri. I usually work an 8-hour shift and the tasks were pretty repetitive, so I often listened on my wireless earbuds connected to my phone under my workstation table. I usually performed with a college student, and she recommended I tried listening to free tarot card readings on YouTube. I kinda liked them. They were usually entertaining, but I once listened to a tarot card reading that creeped me out, and I remembered it. It was some YouTube channel labeled Witch Tarot or something like that. Two older women sat across from each other at a table with strange symbols, and all you saw were their hands and the cards. The women had rough voices and often cackled throughout the reading as if they found it humorous. But the task, everything they were saying, was ominous. They kept saying to watch out for the children. They mentioned a campfire and some wood spirits they called brownies. They explained that there would be a giant bonfire at a party and to watch the children because as they cackled about it, the brownies were known to do dangerous things to harm people and cause mischief. I remembered this reading vividly because the women seemed to find the whole thing darkly humorous. Fast forward 3 months to 4th of July, and a friend of my husband invited our family, my husband and me and our 2 children, to a barbecue party and bonfire. They seemed pretty excited about it, and my husband really wanted to go. But the word bonfire, for whatever reason, made me reluctant inside, and I felt oddly uncomfortable because I remembered the strange witch tarot card reading with the 2 cackling women. I kept that to myself all week but felt increasingly more uncomfortable. The morning of the party, I faked being sick. I just had this nasty, ominous, intuitive, foreboding feeling I could not shake. I begged him. I just said, please stay home, take care of me, and keep the kids at home too. We watched movies that night at home, and my husband was unhappy. The following day, I checked my usual Facebook feed and was shocked to see a picture of a man in the ICU in the hospital, with massive burns all over his body and bandaged up. It turns out it was the woman's husband who invited us to her bonfire party. She said her husband was critically injured with significant burns all over his body. Somehow, it had happened so fast, he had somehow ended up in the bonfire. Nobody knows how it happened, not even he does. They thought he got drunk and tripped. Fortunately, others could pull him out before the burns themselves became too bad, and they called an ambulance. Maybe it's all coincidence, but I'm delighted I did not take my family, especially my children, there that night. Creature Encounter in Northwest England by Harlem Karma. I'm a 16-year-old living in the northwest of England, and I encountered a creature that was so strange that I believe it resembled a dinosaur. The encounter happened in 2019, sometime in December, when I was with friends in the small village of Bolton-les-Sands. We all met one day, hoping to build a bushcraft shelter like the ones you see all over YouTube. One of my friends at the time, James, said he knew of an isolated and hidden spot. Everything we could have hoped for, so we all agreed to follow him to the unknown location. After about 20 minutes of walking through farmers' fields and thin paths, we were met with a barbed wire fence, and to the left of that, on a tree, there was a sign that said, "Private." As young kids, we ignored the warning and carefully climbed over the metal fence. After we all successfully got over, we looked around for a brief minute to observe the creepy yet somewhat beautiful forest. It was so scary that some of the trees looked like tortured souls with faces. Maybe we were all just being paranoid, but we all got a similar feeling that we were being watched by something or someone. After about 5 minutes of walking through the dense woodland, one of my friends said he had seen movement in the distance. He pointed forward, and to all our shock, there in plain sight we laid eyes on the strangest, most obscure creature I've ever seen. It looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie. The best way I could describe it was that the beast looked like one of those raptors from Jurassic Park. We panicked as we watched it quickly run into the neighboring tree line. I counted down from 5 to 1, and we all ran backwards to the fence and climbed over it with sheer fear as if the creature was chasing after us. We ran, with no stopping, back to my house. We sat in my living room and discussed what we had just freaking seen. We all agreed at the same time that it looked like a dinosaur. Nowadays, none of those friends believe or even take recognition of the encounter, and they all put it down as some sort of crazy natural thing we probably saw, like a deer. I don't know how they could even mistake that for a deer though. To be honest, I'm happy that I saw what I saw that day, as it led me to create the YouTube channel that I run today and find many cool podcasts like your own. The Creepy Woods by Spooky Cookies. I don't know what happened, and it's really freaking me out. I just need some help understanding what happened to me and my friends. I want to preface this by saying it's 3 a.m. while I'm writing this, and I'm sorry for any grammar mistakes. Now let me explain. 2 days ago, I was with my friends, Callie and Xander, and we were at my grandparents' house while they were out of town because I am a caretaker of the house when they are gone usually, and my friends wanted to hang out for some time, so I invited them over. After I finished all my chores, I decided I wanted to take them to my old hideout in the woods. I remember telling them the woods were off limits and that I'd be in trouble if my uncle caught us here. Xander was a little hesitant but ended up going with me and Callie. They both agreed to go. I did not force them. Like a group of stupid teens in a horror movie, we all walked into the woods looking just to have some fun and mess around. We get to the opening of the woods, and I tell them it will be a huge climb. Callie pulls out her phone and starts recording. Xander sounds scared and says he's not good at climbing, but Callie convinces him to go anyway. After Xander agrees, Callie screams, "Bring it on!" jokingly. It's essential for the story later. Before entering the woods with Xander and myself, we get about halfway to the hideout when Xander stops and says he has an eerie feeling. I tell him it's probably just nothing, he's probably just over-worrying, and we continue walking. We were at my old hideout in a few minutes, and Callie started being loud and obnoxious. I reminded her to be quiet because of my uncle. At some point, Xander asked if we could leave because his back was starting to hurt. So I do believe we got up and started walking back at that time. We left the woods and started to walk back to the house when Xander and Callie started to freak out, saying they didn't have a good feeling. I told them I didn't feel anything, but I got a terrifying image right as I said that. It was of this thing that was 6'5". It was like a shadow, black as night. It was a muscular figure with horns crawling on all fours. I tell them this, and Callie says she needs to sit down because it feels like someone just punched her in the stomach, and then she collapses onto the ground. I look at Xander and ask him to help me get her up. She was still awake but really out of it. We walk with her and only get a few steps when she regains consciousness. She looks at us and says, "I'm scared." After she says this, we hear a little kid screaming bloody murder. Without thinking, we all begin to sprint back to the house. We return to the house and Xander and I are freaking out, but Callie, she is oddly calm. It's like she wasn't even affected by this anymore. We asked her what was wrong and she wouldn't answer. 5 minutes into trying to see if she's okay, she starts mumbling in a language that definitely wasn't English. And for as long as I've known Callie, I've only known her to know English. She keeps mumbling and then starts laughing too. I tell Xander to get Callie to the car while I run inside to lock the doors. I lock the house down and then I run to my car. Xander is holding Callie now and I'm trying to find my keys. I find it in my pocket and I unlock the car for Xander and Callie to get in. I hop in the car and crank it while Xander gets her buckled in. Xander gets in the car and I rush out of there, heading to my dad's house to get my sage and stuff because at this point, Xander and I feel like Callie's possessed. I'm speeding through some back roads to get to my dad's house quicker because I realized the longer we're in the car, the worse Callie was getting. She was becoming unresponsive and not reacting to anything we were saying to her. She was completely catatonic in a sense. We get her to my dad's house and I run inside to get the sage. I told Xander to take her outside to the backyard so my neighbors wouldn't see us. Xander sits her down and I light the sage, smudging the sage and saying something along the lines of "This is her body, not yours, you need to leave, I do not welcome you here." And things about like that. It took about 20 minutes, but eventually, Callie starts coming back to her normal self. We asked her what was happening, and she said she didn't remember anything and felt trapped. 6 or 7 minutes later, my dad called me and told me he had just left work and that he was going to pick up some dinner. I told him I had some friends over and he offered to get them food too. At this point, we had began to calm down. We told him what we want, eat, and laugh like nothing had happened. But unfortunately, the story doesn't end here. The next day, my friend Xander didn't come to school. I texted him asking if he was okay, and this is what he said to me. "Yeah, I'm fine. Something happened last night though, and it made me stay up until 3 a.m., so my mom let me stay home." He followed up with, "I think a spirit attached to me, like an evil one." Callie texted me saying something felt very wrong at her house as well. She sent me a video, and it was her walking into her room and the blinds were moving by themselves. Stuff was knocked off the shelves and she was freaking out because none of her family were home. She was alone all hours of the day after school, and to be honest, I don't like the feeling I get sleeping at my dad's. Not to mention I have guinea pigs and they've been acting weird since this happened. Like they're more aggressive towards each other and myself now. I can't explain it. Why I'll Never Revisit Colorado by Anonymous. Let me start by giving some background. I'm a 25-year-old man. I love the outdoors. Anything to do with camping, swimming, ice skating, anything to do with the outdoors in general is my thing. Well, this story takes place in a snowy tundra back on the date of 11/13/2017 in the Colorado Rocky Mountains National Park. My friend Jay, John, and Alyssa were going up there for a camping session, as we all have this in common now. I know, I heard the stories on this channel a million times of people going into the national parks and never returning, but this is something entirely different. We thought this was going to be a nice getaway, but it quickly turned into a hell I'll never forget. I'll always be thankful for the shotgun and the bullets I had gotten from my cousin. He makes dragon breath style type shells. For this will be important later. So, back to what we were doing. It was like any other day, traveling from Berks County, Pennsylvania, all the way up to the Rockies. As you can imagine, this was one hell of a 3-day plan for us to get there. We would leave Friday and come home on a Sunday. Well, everything was good for most of the trip. You know how long rides go, staying in crappy motels and stopping and eating very sketchy gas station food. Anyways, we finally arrived at the Colorado Rocky Mountain National Forest on a day colder than most. We had the usual traveling stuff for this sort of thing, and we made sure to pack extra clothing. We wanted to make sure we were plenty warm for what Mother Nature presented us, because what she showed us that day was, to say the least, harsh climate weather. So we began our trek into the mountains, and everything was going very well. Nothing crazy happened, except for the occasional breeze of wind, until nighttime hit. We established a base camp at roughly 15 miles that day, deep inside the Rockies. We got a fire going, and we're grilling some weenies and beans. Nothing wrong with that. Until I went to take a leak. I had this unbearable, unshakable feeling like we were not alone, and I could feel this before my foot touched the ground. I got bad vibrations instantly. The moment I was alone, I got major red flags. Me being me, I didn't want to spook my friends, so I didn't say anything, and just kept a lookout. Besides, my friends weren't really big into cryptids or ghosts or anything spooky like that, so I didn't want to really kill the vibe. As moving forward into the story seems this feeling I got went away, but at the same time, it still kind of stayed close. I zipped up my pants and went back to my friend who was already getting drunk and eating. Thankfully, nothing else happened that night, so we ate and called it a night. Sometime around 2:37 a.m., I had awoken harshly in my sleep to this god-awful feeling of being watched. Like if you've ever stared at someone for so long as they joke, and they turn around and then suddenly you're there. Well, that's almost the way I felt, but in the tents were just Jay, Alyssa, who were a couple, and myself. So they slept on their own side, and I was on my own. I zipped up the flap and poked my head out of my tent slowly. I was looking around and I saw nothing. Everybody else was in their tents, and honestly, it seemed that people were sleeping. I slowly crawled back into my sleeping bag, and somehow, out of the grace of God, I managed to fall back to sleep. The next day we get up, and nothing seems out of the ordinary. The sun is out, but it looked like it snowed a bit. Trying to be rational and thinking maybe I was just hearing things and we're in the mountains, it tends to snow a bit here and maybe I just heard that last night. As the day progresses though, I noticed something my friends never did. It was absolutely silent all around us the entire time. And while I've been out in the woods near cougars and bears and know that when predators are around it goes quiet, this was something much different. John turns to me with a beer in his hand and somewhat getting wasted already, around noon, and he says, "What's the problem, man? You seem like you've seen a monster or something." I've told them about my encounters in the past with things that I believed to be dogman and stuff. And usually, they were more cool about it, but I'm assuming the alcohol kind of made them kind of jerks. Jay and Alyssa are more sensitive to this and don't patronize me for believing in such things, as they know there is no judgment for what others believe. That's what made us friends in the first place. Anyways, getting off topic, I tell him to shut up and tell him to stop being drunk. We stand in silence for a minute listening though, and eventually, he does admit that he doesn't hear anything. Alyssa breaks the ice and says, "Why is it so silent?" I immediately tell her nothing, probably just your regular Colorado bobcat. Now, I know these things can get big, so I assure them not to worry. I brought a nice warming gift if it decided to say hello, reassuring them that my trusty old Remington 870 pump action shotgun would definitely get the job done. They turn around and continue the walk. Maybe if I said what I really felt, none of this would have actually happened as it did. So, we were about 50 miles inside the Colorado Mountain National Park. And it's evening time. John was drunk as a skunk. He pitched his tent poorly. What do you want from a guy getting drunk since noon? It was at least 6 o'clock when we arrived further in. John, being John, decided that they weren't going to help set up and they were just going to sleep. Which, honestly, we didn't bother him, because he was sauced up and would be more useful sleeping. Me, Jay, and Alyssa unpacked and pitched our tents and established a fire to cook the cubed steak with greens and other goodies in a pot that we brought for our 3-day trip. As we cook the food, I tell Jay I'm going to have a look around. I left my shotgun behind and told Jay if anything happens, point, breathe, and shoot. But be careful, she's a hot one. He'll soon realize what I meant by this. So I go on my little journey. I like to call these big walking trips, if you will. It's just something I called them since I was a kid. I'm loving it though, because it's just me and the sun was going down just over the horizon, giving me more peace of mind. But at the same time, it got me thinking from earlier. What was with that sense of silence? Was it really some sort of big cat or bear? So now, I realize it's been an hour, and it's about to be dark out. I've been walking in a straight line for an hour. I turned around and began the trek back to camp, but I could not help this feeling of being watched the entire time. Like if I were to turn around, there would be nothing there, but you could just feel like something, or someone was staring you down. I ignored the best I can, and soon reached back to camp. Alyssa woke up John, and John, being John, winding down from the beers he had earlier, decided to say, "What are you doing? Looking for a girlfriend out here or something?" I laughed and said, "Yeah, she's real sturdy and goes timber when I make her go down." Jay laughs a bit, and so does Alyssa. John just grumbles and says, "Are we eating or what?" Of course the meal was ready, and it had been for about 2 hours. Jay and Alyssa had been waiting for me, so, like always, we dig in as a group. I was in heaven for the time being, sharing laughs with my friends and just enjoying the food and getting away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Little did any of us know, though, that would be one of the worst nights we would ever experience. We all finish up and get ready to hit the bed. It's about 9 going on 10 p.m., and we have a long day ahead of us. We will be hiking all the way back to where we started, which would roughly take a bit to get back. So, John says he must take a pee. I say, well, go ahead. If you're looking for a bathroom, it's all around you. He tells me to shut up, and I snicker a bit. John goes off, and Jay and Alyssa are now in their tent trying to unwind. I was outside, still stoking the fire and thinking, as I usually do. I eventually stop poking the fire and look around. That feeling of being watched comes back, but intensifies as all get out. I yell for John, but I get no response. I again call out louder for John, and still,
Get no response. I tell him to stop playing games and come back and get some rest, man. We gotta get up early. Again, I get no response. I'm starting to get freaked out now, so I go and try to find him. I went in the direction that I saw him going, which was about 100 to 150 yards in. I'm yelling for him, searching everywhere, and can find absolutely nothing. I then stop and look around and observe my surroundings a bit better. I noticed once again it was dead silent, like to the point you can hear your ears ringing. I begin walking slightly in a different direction, because I see what looks like John's head peering out near a tree side. I begin saying, "Come on, man, you're not scaring me. I've been in worse situations." Then what I see next has me stop immediately in my tracks. There was John. He was there with what looked like an icicle sticking out of his neck. I'd say it was 3 feet in length if I had to guess. But I don't even know how to describe what I saw. I know this kind of damage can only be done by something strong though, something otherworldly. What could decapitate somebody and then impale them on an icicle? Now, I've listened to the Swamp Dweller show for a long time. I've heard of stories of skinwalkers and wendigos and stuff like that. But one that I heard about recently was the Washuge, and this seemed to be a perfect match. But out here, this is far away from its original territory. I'm not even sure there have ever been sightings in this area. I say I know this because I have seen some very interesting information from a friend who has gone up against what he believes to be a Washuge in the past and lived to tell the tale. Of course, he has some markings on himself to prove this, and I'll have to ask if he can be polite enough to send some pictures in for you guys. I'd love to show you if they are willing. Anyways, as I looked at John's body, his throat gushed out with blood from such a deadly weapon had me shaking a bit, because this wasn't some cryptid you get away from. This is one you prepare to die when you meet it. I'm trying to go over every scenario in my head. As I'm examining the body, I heard Alyssa screaming and flakes begin to form around as I ran fast, trying to get to the camp. As I get back, I finally see Jay and Alyssa totally freaked the hell out, saying they saw some sort of 13-foot looking monster staring at them from 200 yards away in the tree line. Apparently, she ran back to the camp as fast as she could because she was peeing at the time. She wasn't even that far away from the campsite. It started to snow pretty hard at that time, so I got my shotgun and made sure it was ready, and I told Alyssa to stick by Jay's side, and I gave Jay a cast iron sheet for cooking and told them to use this as a shield, and no matter what, don't break the line. He asked me about John, but I looked at him and gave him this look as to not say it out loud and get Alyssa freaked the hell out though, but I think he apparently understood me and was kind of thankful about it. As we began to get ready for a fight of our life, we tried to form a barrier-like line and began to steady jog as snow began to pour down. I didn't care much for the cold. If I got what was left of my friends out of there, that was all that mattered to me. We begin our trek back to the car, but suddenly, I don't know how to explain it. I don't know if you have ever had this feeling before. It's that feeling that you get in the pit of your stomach when you react before something actually happens. Well, this was me. Somehow, I pushed Jay and Alyssa over and got grazed by some sort of icicle. It was about 3 feet long. It was like something launched it at me, similar to how you would throw a spear or maybe shoot an arrow from a bow. My friends helped me up, and I told them, "Here are the keys to the car. Go now, don't look back, and run as fast as you can. I'll be there in no time." As they were freaked the hell out, they listened to me. They were reluctant on leaving me behind, but I eventually got them to go. I distracted this thing as my friends made it to the car. So here's where things get absolutely crazy. Remember the shells I told you about? Well, I just now remembered Washuge are weak to fire. So here it was, me and this what I can only assume is a Washuge, all alone for some reason. This thing really seemed to want me. After all, it saw me as the strongest, I guess. It wanted to pick me off first and let my friends go, knowing damn well it could kill them too before they made their decision to do so. The snow dies down, and I am met with this monstrosity of a creature. Like Alyssa said, this thing has to be 13 feet. That's right, but the way its body was,
The way it stood there frozen like a statue, only breathing from its open mouth. It was absolutely a sight to behold. If I didn't see the steam releasing from its mouth, I would think this thing was dead. Here we are, the big showdown. I put up my shotgun. The distance between me and the Washuge was at least 10 feet. We could probably reach out our hands and meet in the middle and touch. It was snowing really hard though, and it was almost impossible to see each other, even though we were barreling down on each other. I think back to John, and then think to myself, and all those other people that have gone missing in the past couple of years in this park. Was it this thing that had done it? I didn't care. All I knew is that I wanted it dead. It wasn't so much as revenge but justice in my words. As I put the gun up to shoot the Washuge, it was already on its attack, and it felt like time stood still for a few seconds. I reacted so fast I just closed my eyes and shot point blank range. I peeked my eye open to see that I got it right in the face, and this thing was burning. This whole thing's body caught on fire. I stood back a bit, feeling the dragon's breath round burn the Washuge. I took another shot at it, and I got it right in the chest this time. Hearing this thing's horrific, painful screech, this thing rolled over, and I swear I heard it mumble something like,
"You'll die a horrible death."
And like that, the yellow-eyed pinpricks for this thing's eyes glowed, but the Washuge was clearly dead. I picked myself up, saying I'm sorry to John for being an ass to him. I should have been a better friend, because you never know when it could be your last word. Instead of finding the negative, I should have found out why he was the way he was. But to you, sir, I hope you're somewhere better. As for my friends, they made it safe. I soon arrived. It becoming day roughly about 6:36 a.m., I got back to the car, put my shotgun in the back, got in, and didn't say anything the entire ride back. Now, I know my story might sound completely unbelievable, and I completely understand that. Even my own friends don't really want to believe it. I'd rather that than an argument, though. About a year has passed now, and I finally told Alyssa what happened after about 3 months. I told her what actually happened to John and how I killed the creature. Her and Jay also broke up, and she hasn't heard anything from him since. Honestly, I think it really affected us all differently. I don't know. Some days, I wonder if this thing will come find me or my friends. Honestly, I think it might be best that I cut all ties with everyone involved. And after hearing about Sam White Owl, I'm going to do my best to join these people who hunt down these beasts. So, everyone I kill will be one less to worry about. Thank you, Swamp, and hello to all the swamp folk alike. May you be safe out there. You have no idea what's in the dark watching.
Nursing Home Night Shift by Alyssa S. When I was younger, somewhere around 20 years old, I'm now 32, I worked in an assisted living home in rural Minnesota. I enjoyed the job, helping the elderly. Once I discovered that I really enjoyed the job, I planned to honestly further my career in nursing. I worked overnights in the assisted living building as it fits well with my college schedule. I was one of the only younger people on the night shift, working alongside people in their mid-30s and up. I learned a lot from these people, heard scary stories of their experiences, and made some friends I still have. One night though, while working there, I was scheduled on the 3rd floor with about 15 residents. I'd gotten to know most of them and was relatively close to a few. One lady, who we will call Judy, was my absolute favorite. She was a sweetheart, and we would spend hours talking when she would be awake at night, unable to fall asleep. Judy was somewhere in her 80s and in pretty good shape. This particular night, Judy rang me to her room to receive help fixing her TV. After tightening the cables on the back of her TV, we sat and talked for about 20 minutes or so. She told me how she planned to walk to the nearby park in the morning, something she did every morning. She'd walk to the park with a bread bag, sit on the benches beside the water, and feed the geese. After talking, I told her I had to go do my rounds and that I'd see her the next night. We said our goodbyes, and I was leaving her room. She said, "Alicia, you're a good kid." I smiled and went to do my rounds. A few hours later, my coworkers and I decided to go outside and have a smoke somewhere around 4:30 a.m.
We sat outside in the cold, 40-degree weather and smoked and chit-chatted. As we sat there, we noticed an older lady walking down the sidewalk away from the building. I thought she looked familiar, and I realized who it was when I saw the bag of bread she was carrying. "That's pretty early for Judy, don't you think?" my coworker said. "I guess so," I replied. We laughed and continued smoking. Then our pages started buzzing and we rushed inside. When we met the coworker who paged us, they had a distinct, sad look. They hugged me for about 30 seconds. The whole time I was confused. This coworker knew my family, so I worried something might have happened. Confused as ever, I followed them to the elevator and up to the 3rd floor. My heart fell as they led me to Judy's room. I heard sirens in the background and knew this wasn't good. To my shock, it was Judy, lying lifeless in her bed. My coworkers and I glanced at each other, astonished. I felt a mixture of sadness and confusion. Haven't we? I swear to God, we had just seen Judy walking toward the park. I knew I wasn't crazy because my coworker saw her too. We never really brought it up again. As scary as it was, I just decided that Judy was probably doing the thing she loved the most that night before she passed, walking to the park to feed the geese. Who Killed Chris? By Anonymous. On Halloween night 2002, 21-year-old Chris Jenkins, a University of Minnesota student, went to celebrate the spookiest night of the year down at the Lone Tree Bar and Grill with his girlfriend Ashley Rice and 3 other friends. Chris was separated from his friends shortly after midnight and ejected from the bar. According to reports later given to police, a drink was accidentally spilled on his pants, and the security supervisor assumed that Chris was so intoxicated that he urinated himself. After Chris was removed, the security guard was instructed not to let him back inside. Unfortunately for Chris, since his Native American Halloween costume had no pockets, he had to ask Ashley to hold his wallet, keys, and cell phone in her purse. His coat was left inside in the bar, and what turned out to be a chilly 20-degree night would be brutal for him. Since he was not the designated driver, Chris could not get a ride home and could not contact his friends inside the bar. He was last seen headed away from the bar on foot, but did not return to his residence and was eventually reported as a missing person. On February 27th, the following year, Chris Jenkins' bloated, decaying corpse was found floating beneath a bridge on the Mississippi River. He was still dressed in his Halloween costume and had gotten wedged in the branches of a large tree next to the upper St. Anthony Falls Dam. The medical examiner found no foul play on Chris's body, so drowning was the official cause of death. Despite the police ruling it death by misadventure, his family launched their own independent investigation and discovered several odd discrepancies. The Jenkins family hired a private detective, Chuck Lausch, to investigate their son's disappearance further. When Lausch questioned staff of the Lone Tree Bar and Grill, they maintained that Chris had left the bar alone. The venue's owner eventually issued a gag order instructing employees not to speak to anyone without an attorney present. Now, this was weird to the investigator. They also contacted the Federal Reserve Bank, which happened to be the owner of the 2 CCTV cameras that had a good view of the Hennepin Avenue Bridge. The bridge was on the route that Jenkins was likeliest to have taken, but when the bank checked their surveillance footage from the early morning hours of November 1st, there was no sign of him. Lausch's investigation also led him to multiple witnesses who each independently recalled a fight in front of a local pizza place. Though it was unclear if the victim was Chris, a gang of around 9 or 10 people had violently attacked another outside the restaurant. Mike Casey, an off-duty police officer, was in the area of the night of Jenkins' disappearance. He was moonlighting as security guard for a nearby Hennepin Center for Arts and was introduced to Jenkins by his girlfriend, Ashley Rice. Ashley happened to work at the Lone Tree Bar and Grill and was familiar with Casey, well enough that she happened to borrow pieces of his uniform to complete her cliched sexy cop costume. The rumors are that Casey had masterminded Jenkins' removal from the bar to get with Ashley, given that he gave her a ride home later that night when she finished the shift. The Minneapolis Police Department never formally questioned Casey, but stated that he's a married man with children, we don't want to break up a family. which is a damning statement in its own right. The Jenkins family hired 2 bloodhound trackers to trace Chris's scent from the Lone Tree Bar to an underground parking lot across the street. The scent led to parking stalls where one of the bar's bouncers reportedly parked on Halloween night. A bloodhound produced a mild hit for Chris's scent on this person's vehicle. Droplets of blood residue, a piece of red string, and a red feather fragment possibly belonging to the headband of Jenkins' costume were also found in the garage. Jenkins' blood alcohol content was only 0.12%, so he could not have been particularly drunk. But oddly enough, coroners, they noted that traces of GHB were found in Chris's system. However, since GHB is a substance that is produced by the body naturally, this does not necessarily mean that Chris was drugged. Forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden took issue with Jenkins' body being found with his arms crossed out in front of him. Drowning victims who accidentally fall into the water are almost always face down with their arms out towards their sides and their clothing disheveled. Yet Jenkins' shirt was tucked in, with his drawstring pants and his oversized slip-on moccasins were still on his feet. This led to speculation that Chris was already dead when he was placed in the river. Hydrologists who studied the Mississippi River were highly skeptical that Chris's body could have been in the water for as long as 4 months without being seen, as the river did not freeze until January. Moreover, the area beneath 3rd Avenue Bridge was searched in the weeks following the disappearance with no sign of him. A daytime thawing occurred on February 27th, the day Chris's body was found, so he possibly floated from another location before his body got wedged between the tree branches. Jenkins' family found it highly unusual that his body had no bruising. Their son was an enthusiastic lacrosse player, a goalie who often came home from practice with giant purple and yellowing patches on his legs and forearms. Since these bruises were absent, his parents believed that he may have been alive for a couple of days after he went missing, allowing enough time for his bruises to heal. 3 years later, in 2006, the Jenkins family met with Minneapolis Police Chief Tim Dolan, who had decided to reopen the investigation based on newly attained evidence. Chris's death was eventually reclassified as a homicide, and Chief Dolan held a press conference to apologize to the Jenkins family formally. Years later, Dolan would state that he estimated Jenkins' death was 50% chance of homicide, 30% chance of accidental death, and 20% chance of suicide. Once the case of Jenkins' death was reopened, an informant told authorities he had witnessed somebody throw Chris's body off the Hennepin Avenue Bridge into the Mississippi River. Now, still, there was some skepticism about this story since Chris had no bones broken, no injuries that really showed that he would have been tossed over a bridge. It has a high safety railing and would have been impossible without his body hitting a steel support beam and a vertical metal cable on the way down. In July of 2007, the Hennepin County District Attorney's Office announced that they had been approached about filing charges against a suspect in Chris's murder, but apparently they declined to do so. The suspect in question was Jeremy Alford, who was serving a life sentence for the brutal murder of a man named Douglas Miller. Alford admitted to being a regular drinker at the Lone Tree Bar and Grill around 2002. Chris, his case had been connected to the infamous smiley face killer, as his death occurred around the same time that many college-age men in the Midwest were discovered, but I think it might be a little bit closer to the Alford thing. But unlike many other cited cases to the smiley face killer or killers, no smiley face graffiti was ever found around Chris's death, and it just seems like, as of right now, there's not much more to say. Weird Creature in Minnesota by Jester Prince. I moved to Minnesota about 6 months ago, and it's a pretty cold state. More or less I love it here. It's very peaceful, and when it snows it's beautiful. However, my image of Minnesota has changed last night. My mom and stepfather sat down to watch a movie in the living room. As the movie was about to end, we paused because my mom wanted to smoke, and I had to use the restroom. I was sitting down with my stepdad once I came back from the bathroom. A few seconds later, my mom opens the patio door and yells for us to leave. We rush outside and she tells us that she starts hearing the noise of something very large walking in the snow. When she began to look around from where the noise could be coming from, about 40 feet away was what she could only describe as some sort of white creature.
She said that when she looked over there, she saw something with red eyes staring at her. She said it looked like a giant dog of some sort, but it looked all wrong. At first, my stepdad said it was probably a coyote. Then I was thinking about how my mom heard this from about 40 or 50 feet away. That would be a really, really big coyote. And I realized it would have had to been large, you know? I've always been one to believe in paranormal things. My mother, not so much. We looked around for a bit longer and then went inside again. A few hours later, I leave my room to grab a soda to continue playing Halo. After the whole event, I had this unshakable feeling. So I decided just to look outside to reassure myself that everything was okay and I was just seeing things. As my eyes scan the edge of the woods, I don't see anything. I take a deep breath, grab the soda, and close the fridge. As I close the door, I glimpse out the window and freeze. Sure enough, I see a pair of red eyes peering at me through the trees. I couldn't see much because of how dark it was. It was around 3 a.m. at the time, but I know what I saw. This was something that I've never seen before. Those red eyes went right through me. Then, as quickly as I had seen them, they disappeared. What do you guys think I saw? Researching the darkest and most depressing topics online will undoubtedly present you with many tragic cases that are never solved. I often encounter cases that seem to have been forgotten and ignored by our justice system. As I keep looking into these things, I notice this more and more. I keep finding a trend of lazy and unjust investigation conducted by law enforcement, especially in the 1980s it seems. I have made it my mission to shine a light on these cases in hopes that one of you watching may have some information to share. The story we are covering today is a genuinely failed case by the justice system. The story of what happened to Keith Warren has haunted his family for over 30 years now. Officials claim he took his life, but the evidence points to something much more nefarious. What happened to Keith Warren? Well, let's do our best to find out. At 19 years old, Keith Warren was on his way to a promising and bright future. He had recently graduated from Kennedy High School in Silver Spring, Maryland. He was on his way to college and pursuing further education. During the summer, he was hanging out with friends and working a few jobs. Keith worked at Glenmont Chrysler and Belle Pre Shell. I am unsure for how long he worked there or what his schedule looked like. Before I go any further, I want to stop and say that most of this information I have on this case came directly from Mary Warren, Keith's mother herself. Mary has been running and maintaining a website dedicated to her son's unjust death for over 30 years. She has made it her mission to not only put the facts of this case, but point out the prejudice and negligence of the local police force. You can check out additional information, evidence, and documentation, and even donate to the investigation at the KeithWarrenJusticeSite.com, which is currently maintained by the family. Keith was well-liked and a personable person who made friends very quickly. Safe to say this would be a double-edged sword. Keith had made friends with some undesirable people over the summer, some of which may have been involved in drugs and crime. Now that we are more acquainted with the background of the situation, let's dive into this story. Keith received a phone call on Tuesday, July 29, 1986, and then left home to hang out with some friends. Keith never came home. The next day, Keith's mother, Mary Warren, called the Montgomery County Police and notified them that Keith was a potential missing person. Mary was told that until 48 hours had passed, they could not go look for him unless he had an extreme medical condition. He was an adult after all. 2 days after Keith Warren hadn't returned home after hanging out with friends, paramedics from the nearby fire and rescue station got a call from a girl who claimed someone had committed suicide in the basement of their house. The house in question is 14655 Tynewick Drive, not too far from Keith's home. Rescue personnel arrived at the scene and were met by 3 people: Chip Wynn, the house owner, Claudia Lawson, Chip's girlfriend, and an unidentified male. I could not find much more about that third person. Officials had been informed that Claudia had been the one who called in the report.
When officials asked to see the basement, they were suddenly told the body was in the woods. When officials asked the group to join them in the woods, they declined and sent Claudia. Claudia had never given a reason why she had called, saying the suicide was in the basement. This screams a red flag for me, significantly since Claudia would yet again change the storytelling. She had stumbled upon Keith's body while walking her dog in the woods. The paramedic on the scene, Dallas Lip, noted that this scene did not look like a suicide. Montgomery police officer Luther Leverett from the Wheaton Glenmont police station responded to the scene and took over. According to Mary Warren, this officer seemed to know who Keith was and who Chip Wynn was. She admittedly claims the officer, Luther Leverett, did not follow the proper police procedure and did not secure the scene and close off the area to preserve evidence. According to multiple bystanders, the police officer seemed to be in a rush and was very unprofessional. Officer Leverett said, "Why would this have to happen on my lunch break? This is highly concerning to me. I couldn't imagine an officer of the law reacting this way to a suspected suicide." According to the reports, Officer Leverett immediately ruled the death a suicide. Over the radio, he told the county coroner not even to bother coming and to mark the end as a suicide. In the reports, Leverett notes Keith had, and I quote, apparently jumped off of a log. The paramedic who arrived on the scene stated there was no log or anything else for Keith to jump off in the area. Officer Leverett removed the body from the tree, had Keith's body sent to Colin's funeral home, and immediately embalmed the body. This is, of course, not the proper procedure. It wasn't until 7 hours later that Keith's family was notified about his death. Now, think about this for a moment. They had processed the entire scene, sent the body to a funeral home, skipped a trip to the morgue, and never told the family their loved one had been killed, let alone committed suicide. This is absolutely unacceptable on every level. Officer Leverett was given Mary Warren's work number and offered a phone to call her, but they declined and said to have her call him when she got home. What sense does that make? After receiving a call from her neighbor telling her to call Officer Leverett, she was distraught and couldn't tell Mary what was wrong. Upon finding out the news, Mary screamed and was told that Officer Leverett was out on another call and would not be available for at least 2 hours. Again, what sense does it make that we have to wait for a specific cop to get information about a situation involving your child? Roughly 2 hours later, Leverett showed up at Mary's work and questioned her about Keith. Mary had mentioned he had been missing for 2 days, and that's when he dropped the bombshell on her. He told her that Keith had committed suicide and asked why he would have done such a thing. The following few statements are from Mary herself. I wanted to include her exact words to truly express how deceitful this investigation was to her son's death. I asked if the officer had found him. Officer Leverett responded that yes, he had been found, and he had committed suicide. He questioned me why Keith would have committed suicide, preying upon the innate pain and guilt that any mother would feel upon receiving such a message. I cooperated with him the best I could while agonizing over this revelation. At the time, I trusted Officer Leverett. Even though I could not think of any reason why my son would take his own life, I tried to think of any recent disagreements between my son and me. The only thing that came to mind was my strong objection to Keith's choice of car. Officer Leverett later exaggerated my statement and used it to substantiate his creation of a reason. It was Officer Leverett's idea that Keith had become depressed over this and committed suicide. Although Keith had no history of drugs, I asked Officer Leverett several times whether drugs were involved. Given that the area of Aspen Hills where he lived had reported drug activity amongst teenagers, he emphatically replied, no. Upon his departure an hour later, Officer Leverett handed me a business card from Colin's funeral home in Silver Spring and told me to contact them after 9 a.m. the next day. At first, Mary said she believed the narrative that Keith took his own life was true. She had yet to realize or to be educated on the details of the case. As far as she knew, Keith was found and sent to a morgue. When she learned this and found many discrepancies too numerous to ignore, she had concluded that this was no suicide, and others agree with her. After Mary met with Officer Leverett, she called her brother and had him go to the funeral home ASAP and identify the body. For whatever reason, he was denied entry multiple times and told to come back the next day. After a full 24 hours, they finally let them very briefly see the body of Keith Warren. And a bit of cherry on top, Mary was even sued later for not paying for the services even though she had not ordered them to embalm her son's body. At every step, the officials were making this as hard as possible for the Warren family, and for no seemingly good reason. When Mary requested her son's clothing, she was told they were destroyed because the amount of body decomposition had deteriorated the clothes, which makes no sense to anyone with a brain cell. Bodies do not decompose that badly in 2 days in those circumstances. Now, it might be more believable if this were in a swampy area or something along those lines, but it wasn't. Mary also refuted this. She even works in pathology for a living. She also requested the rope and eventually was given a brown bag containing the string and Keith's signature brown boots. A few days after Keith's body was found, the Montgomery police chopped down the tree. They claim to have done so to collect further evidence, but nothing has seemingly come from it. Police treated this case as a suicide from the very beginning and called it an open and shut case. I firmly believe this is not the case, and Mary Warren agrees. There are so many unanswered questions here. Why was protocol not followed? Why was the family not contacted until 7 hours later? Why was the body not sent to the coroner? Why was the tree cut for evidence if this was a suicide? Most importantly, why does the evidence point to murder? A few years later, on April 9th, 1992, Mary had found an envelope addressed to her on her front porch. There was no return address or anything like that. She opened it to find original copies of the police photos from the crime scene. Mary has never figured out who sent these to her, but a note was included in the envelope. According to this note, Mark Finley and another redacted person would be next. 4 months later, Mark Finley was killed in what was claimed to be a freak bicycle accident. Even stranger yet, Mary claims her car was broken into, and the note was stolen. But oddly enough, nothing else was taken. After closely inspecting her son's photos, she noticed several odd things. First, she did not recognize the clothing Keith was wearing. She did his laundry and was very familiar with his wardrobe. Second, as Officer Leverett had said, Keith was not wearing his brown boots. He was wearing a pair of white running shoes which were not his. Lastly, Keith is nearly sitting with his feet touching the ground. It doesn't even remotely look like he had jumped from anything. It seems like he was propped up where he was after he was already dead. After receiving these pictures, Mary demanded the case be investigated more thoroughly. Police were shocked by how she had received the images and were now willing to talk to her. Albeit with little interest, the Montgomery County Police refused to move forward even after the new information was presented. Mary requested to see the tree that they had cut down, but they said it had been destroyed in a fire at the police HQ. Why does it seem there is a massive cover-up at every turn here? Assistant State's Attorney Matthew Campbell went on record to say that the police did a poor and sloppy job on this investigation, but still did not have the case reopened. It would seem this would be the end of Keith Warren's story, gone but surely never forgotten. But this is not the end. A group called Clams, Chatter, Laughter, and Mingling Society became interested in this case. It helped raise thousands upon thousands of dollars to have Keith's body exhumed and have independent pathologists and other forensic scientists conduct an autopsy and toxicological exam. 5 separate pathologists found that Keith had died from inhaling or ingesting toxic chemicals and not from asphyxiation. These results were sent to Dr. John Smiliak, the chief medical examiner of the state of Maryland. He declined the report, saying the chemicals were likely from the embalming process. Now, as I feel that could be a logical answer, I also think it would be precious to investigate further into this. According to Keith's mother, some of the chemicals found in Keith's body are not the type used for embalming, and the toxins found were much more lethal than the embalming fluid. Whether Keith took these toxins on his own accord or not is to be proven, but sadly, the official ruling of the death remains suicide by hanging. Keith and his story has been featured on one of my personal favorite shows and inspirations, Unsolved Mysteries. This stirred up many tips, but one was more interesting than the rest. An unknown female from Alabama called in and claimed to have dressed Keith's body. She didn't explain why Keith was undressed, but she did say she dressed him in somebody else's clothing. This tip confirmed for Mary Warren that her son was dead before he was strung up in that tree. This case is truly one of the most tragic I have ever covered. When I stumbled upon this case, I just knew I had to make a video on this and spread awareness for this case. The blatant cover-up from the police boggles my mind. Something more happened here, but I can't say exactly what. However, I can say with certainty that justice was not served here, and a family still grieves over 30 years later. If anyone has any information on what happened to Keith Warren in July of 1986, please send your tips and information to info@thekeithwarrenjusticefoundation.org, or be sure to visit the website thekeithwarrenjustice.com for more information and documentation on this story.